It began where water, roads, and timing collided. Trois-Ponts sat at the meeting of rivers and routes, a small Belgian town shaped by geography long before war ever reached it. Stone bridges arched over cold, fast-moving water. Narrow roads threaded through valleys where hills rose steeply on either side. In peacetime, it was a place defined by flow, traffic passing through, water moving onward, life continuing quietly. In December of 1944, that flow became the very thing armies fought to control. The Ardennes Offensive depended on speed above all else. German plans were built on rapid movement, on armored columns racing west before resistance could solidify. Fuel schedules were tight. Timetables were unforgiving. Every bridge mattered. Every crossroads mattered. And Trois-Ponts mattered more than most, because here, multiple routes converged and then separated again, offering passage deeper into Belgium, or denial that could choke an advance entirely. Winter had already tightened its grip. Snow covered the hills and clung to rooftops. Ice glazed the roads, turning every movement into a calculated risk. Fog settled into valleys and refused to lift. The rivers ran dark and cold, swollen and fast, impossible to cross without bridges. Nature itself seemed to narrow the options long before a single shot was fired. When German units pushed toward Trois-Ponts, they did so with urgency bordering on desperation. Delays elsewhere had already eaten into the schedule. Fuel was not abundant. Armor could not afford detours. The bridges here were not conveniences. They were necessities. But the Allies understood this too. American forces moved quickly to deny the crossings, knowing that holding Trois-Ponts could do more than slow the offensive. It could redirect it into chaos. Engineers prepared demolitions. Infantry took up positions overlooking approaches. Artillery was brought forward to cover roads that funneled directly toward the bridges. The town became tense, coiled, waiting. The first clashes erupted suddenly. Gunfire cracked through the valleys. Artillery shells burst against hillsides, sending rock and snow cascading downward. German advance elements probed the outskirts, searching for gaps, pushing forward with the expectation that resistance would collapse quickly. It did not. When bridges were destroyed, the sound echoed far beyond the town itself. Stone and steel fell into the river below, vanishing beneath churning water. What had been a clear route forward became an impassable barrier in an instant. Armor stalled. Columns backed up. Confusion rippled outward as units scrambled to find alternate crossings that barely existed. Trois-Ponts transformed from a passageway into a trap. German forces attempted to force their way through the surrounding ground, but the terrain resisted them. Valleys narrowed movement, hills restricted maneuver, roads that looked viable on maps proved inadequate under the weight of tanks and supply vehicles. Every attempt to regain momentum cost time, and time was the one resource the offensive could not replace. American defenses tightened, artillery fire bracketed roads and approaches. Infantry held key positions overlooking riverbanks and crossings. Engineers continued to deny movement wherever possible. The town itself absorbed the violence unwillingly. Buildings damaged, streets scarred, civilians forced into basements as explosions shook stone walls. The rivers did their part as well. Cold water surged where bridges once stood, mocking any attempt at crossing. Vehicles that ventured too close risked slipping, stalling, or being destroyed outright. What should have been a brief stop became a prolonged struggle. The Battle of Trois-Ponts was not defined by massive assaults or sweeping maneuvers. It was defined by denial. Denying crossings, denying speed, denying momentum. Every hour German forces spent stalled here was an hour the wider offensive could not recover. Fuel burned uselessly. Schedules collapsed. Units farther west waited for support that would never arrive on time. The ripple effect spread silently, shaping outcomes well beyond the town itself. Eventually, the pressure shifted fully against the attackers. Allied reinforcements arrived. Air power threatened whenever the weather allowed. German units were forced to redirect, detour, or withdraw, their plans unraveling under the weight of geography and resistance. Trois-Ponts remained out of reach, and because it did, something much larger began to fail. When the fighting eased, the town stood damaged but unbroken. Bridges lay ruined, roads were scarred, the rivers continued to flow. The war moved on, but the effect of what happened here lingered. The Battle of Trois-Ponts mattered because it proved a simple truth. In modern war, control of movement can matter more than control of ground. A town does not have to fall to decide a battle. Sometimes, refusing passage is enough. Tonight, we return to that convergence of roads and rivers, to the bridges that never carried armor west, to the cold water that halted steel, to Trois-Ponts, where denial reshaped an entire offensive. Before we continue, I want to connect this moment to you as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has settled around you there? Is it deep into the night, early morning, or somewhere in between? If you find value in these slow, detailed explorations of how small places can change enormous events, consider subscribing, not for constant updates, but so these quiet, thoughtful journeys are always here when you want history that unfolds without rushing you. The stone bridge crosses the Amblève River like it has for over a century, its arches worn smooth by Belgian winters and summer floods. Tourists pause here sometimes, snapping photos of the water rushing below, the forested hills rising on either side. They don't know they're standing on a grave. They don't know that for 90 minutes on a December evening in 1945, this exact spot was the most important 100 feet of ground in Western Europe. Most have never heard the name Trois-Ponts, this quiet crossroads where three rivers converge in the Belgian Ardennes. But in the final winter of the Second World War, Hitler staked his last offensive on capturing these bridges, and 140 American combat engineers, men trained to build, not to fight, stood between the Nazi panzer columns and a breakthrough that could have changed the outcome of the war. December 17th, 1944, 6 o'clock in the morning. The town of Trois-Ponts wakes slowly, smoke rising from chimneys into the gray winter sky. Marie Renard is kneading bread dough in her kitchen when she hears it, a low rumble from the east, like distant thunder, but the sky is clear. Her husband Paul stops mid-stride in the doorway, flour still on his hands from the mill. They've heard artillery before, living this close to the front, but this is different, deeper, closer. In the town square, Henri Baudot is opening his cafe when he sees them, refugees, dozens of them, streaming through the narrow streets with whatever they could carry, old women clutching photographs, farmers dragging carts loaded with furniture, children with wide, terrified eyes. The Germans are coming, they say. Tanks, hundreds of tanks. They killed everyone in Stavelot. The town sits in a natural bowl where three rivers meet, the Amblève, the Salm, and the tiny Lienne Creek. Three bridges cross these waters, built decades ago when Belgium was neutral and nobody imagined panzer divisions would need to cross here. The main bridge, spanning the Amblève, is the largest, a stone arch structure built in 1842, 5 spans stretching 190 feet across the river. A mile south, a smaller steel truss bridge crosses the Salm, and between them runs a railroad viaduct, its stone pillars rising 30 feet above the water. Together, these three crossings form the only viable route for heavy armor moving northwest through this section of the Ardennes. The roads to the north are too narrow, carved into cliff sides. The routes to the south are choked with snow and German traffic. For any mechanized force trying to reach the Meuse River and the open terrain beyond, Trois-Ponts isn't just important, it's inevitable. Population, 2,100 civilians who never ask to be strategic. Most work in the textile mill or the farm surrounding the town. They have lived under occupation before, survived the German advance of 1940, endured 4 years of rationing and curfews and the quiet terror of collaboration accusations. When American forces liberated the region in September, they thought the war was finally moving away from them. They hung American flags from windows. Children begged chocolate from GIs. Now, 3 months later, the war is coming back. And this time, it's bringing the SS. At the American command post in the old schoolhouse, Major Robert Yates is trying to make sense of fragmentary reports coming through on the field telephone. Company C-51st Engineer Combat Battalion, his company, has been stationed in Trois-Ponts for 6 weeks, tasked with maintaining the bridges and roads. It's rear area duty, almost boring after the chaos of the advance across France. His men are construction troops, specialists in demolition and bridge building, not frontline infantry. They have rifles and a few bazookas, enough to defend against stragglers or partisans. Nobody mentioned panzers. The reports he's receiving don't make sense. A major German offensive, breakthrough at Losheim Gap, enemy armor 40 miles deep into Allied lines. It has to be exaggerated, confusion from green troops. But the refugees keep coming, and their stories are consistent. Gray tanks with black crosses, SS troops in knee, camouflage smocks, villages burning. 10 o'clock in the morning. First Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein, platoon leader for Company C's 3rd Platoon, is checking the demolition charges stored in the town warehouse when a runner finds him. Lieutenant, Major Yates wants all platoon leaders at the CP immediately. Edelstein is 24 years old, from New York, an engineering student before the war. He's good with calculations, with stress loads and charge weights and the mathematics of destruction. He's never been in sustained combat. Walking to the schoolhouse, he passes his men working on a broken culvert, joking about getting back to Luxembourg for Christmas. They don't know yet. He doesn't know yet. But in 6 hours, some of them will be dead, and the rest will have done something that military historians will study for the next 80 years. The briefing is short. Enemy offensive confirmed. 6th S Panzer Army driving west. Multiple breakthroughs, all bridges in the sector to be prepared for immediate demolition. Edelstein's platoon draws the main bridge over the Amblève, the most important crossing, the one any German armored column will have to take to continue northwest. "How much time do we have?" someone asks. Yates looks at the map, measuring distances with his fingers. If they're moving at combat speed, assuming resistance at Stavelot holds them even a few hours, maybe until tonight, maybe less. The room goes quiet. Outside, they can hear children playing in the street, unaware. Edelstein thinks about the charges they'll need. 900 pounds of TNT, minimum, placed precisely against the center supports. Electrical detonators with backup fuses. He's done this in training, supervised demolitions on damaged bridges across France. But never with German tanks racing toward him. Never with the outcome of a battle, maybe the entire campaign, depending on whether he gets the math right. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the town is transforming. Engineers are drilling holes into stone bridge supports, manhandling wooden crates of explosives from the warehouse, stringing detonation wire. Civilians are packing whatever they can carry, heading west toward what they hope is safety. Some refuse to leave. This is their home. They survived the last occupation. They'll survive this one. Mayor Claude Marlay is trying to organize an evacuation, while simultaneously demanding to know why the Americans are preparing to destroy the town's bridges, its lifelines. If you blow these bridges, how will we rebuild? How will trade resume? Yates has no good answer. War doesn't care about post-war economies. The rumble from the east is no longer distant. It's constant now, a rolling thunder that makes the windows rattle, smoke visible on the horizon, and still the refugees come, speaking of massacres, of American prisoners shot in a field near Malmedy, of SS troops who take no prisoners and show no mercy. 3:45 in the afternoon, radio bar. Message from divisional headquarters confirms the worst. Enemy column identified as Kampfgruppe Piper, 1st S Panzer Division. Combat strength estimated at 4,000 to 5,000 men, 100-plus armored vehicles, including Tiger and Panther tanks, commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, veteran of the Eastern Front, known for aggressive tactics and speed. Current location, Ligneuville, 8 miles southeast. Rate of advance, limited only by road congestion and fuel consumption. Expected arrival at Trois-Ponts before nightfall. The message ends with 3 words that turn Edelstein's stomach. Hold at all costs. They're not being reinforced. No tank destroyers are being sent. No additional infantry. Company C's 140 engineers, many of them barely trained in rifle marksmanship, are expected to delay an SS Panzer column long enough to destroy the bridges. And if they fail, if those bridges remain intact, the northern shoulder of the entire Allied line could collapse. As the December sun begins its early descent toward the western hills, Trois-Ponts holds its breath. The charges are set, wired in parallel circuits with redundant detonators. Engineers have taken defensive positions in buildings overlooking the bridges, their few bazookas positioned to cover the approach roads. Civilians huddle in cellars, praying in French and Flemish. And somewhere to the southeast, racing through the gathering darkness, a column of German tanks is following a road that leads directly to these bridges, these rivers, this obscure Belgian town that nobody planned for and everyone underestimated. The stone arches built in 1842 by masons who never imagined global war. The steel trusses erected in the quiet years between world wars. the narrow streets and old houses about to become a battlefield. In a few hours, the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the security of entire Allied armies, will rest on whether one lieutenant can time his detonation correctly, whether 140 engineers can hold long enough, whether 90 seconds of courage can change the course of history. The ghost town is about to wake up. December 11th, 1944. A farmhouse in the German Eifel forest, 15 miles behind the Siegfried Line. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper spreads military maps across a rough wooden table, his finger tracing a red line that cuts through the Ardennes like a surgical incision. He's 30 years old, looks older, with the hard eyes of someone who's seen the Eastern Front collapse village by village. Around him, his battalion commanders lean in, studying the route he's been assigned. Rollbahn D, the northernmost attack corridor in Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. The room smells of wood smoke and cold sweat. Outside, in the forest darkness, over 4,000 men and 100 armored. Vehicles are hidden under camouflage netting, waiting for orders that will send them racing west into history, or death, or both. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, battle group, is built for speed, not sustained combat. 1st S Panzer Regiment forms the armored corps, King Tiger tanks with their 88mm guns that can kill an American Sherman at 2,000 yards. Panther tanks, faster and more maneuverable. Panzer Mark IVs, the workhorses of the panzer divisions. Supporting them, mechanized infantry in half-tracks, reconnaissance units in armored cars, engineers with bridging equipment, anti-aircraft vehicles to ward off the Allied fighter bombers that have made daylight movement suicidal across Western Europe. The entire force is motorized, designed to move at combat speed, 20 to 30 miles per hour on good roads, slower in the narrow Ardennes passes. Peiper's mission is brutally simple: penetrate the American lines at the Losheim Gap, drive west through Hansfeld and Bullingen, cross the Amblève River at Trois-Ponts, continue to the Meuse at Huy, and establish a bridgehead for follow-on forces. Timeline: 50 hours from jump-off to Meuse crossing. Anything longer, and Allied reinforcements will seal the gap. Anything slower, and the weather will clear, bringing American air superiority that will turn his column into burning scrap metal. The plan relies on assumptions that Peiper knows are optimistic. First, minimal American resistance in the initial penetration zone, where the line is held by Green divisions resting after the Hurtgen Forest bloodbath. Second, capture of American fuel dumps because the Wehrmacht can barely supply its own forces, let alone fuel a 100-vehicle sprint across 60 miles of enemy territory. Third, bridges intact at key river crossings, especially Trois-Ponts, because German bridging equipment is limited and time is everything. Fourth, bad weather holding, keeping Allied aircraft grounded for the first critical 48 hours. Peiper has fought in Russia, watched brilliant offensive plans collapse when a single variable changed. He knows what he's being asked to do borders on impossible, but he also knows what happens to officers who express doubt about Führer directives. So, he studies the maps, memorizes every village name, every road junction, every bridge that stands between him and the Meuse. His reputation precedes him, and it's not one that invites mercy. In Russia, Peiper led the 1st SS Panzer Division through some of the bloodiest fighting on the Eastern Front. Kharkov, Kursk, the retreat from Ukraine. His unit developed a reputation for speed, for shocking aggression, for not taking prisoners when prisoners would slow them down. There are accusations, investigations still pending, about villages burned with civilians inside, about Soviet PUs executed rather than guarded. Peiper dismisses these as partisan propaganda, the inevitable lies told about victorious soldiers by the defeated. His men are loyal to him with the fanatical devotion that SS indoctrination creates. A mix of ideological commitment and genuine respect for a commander who leads from the front, who shares the risks, who delivers victories when other units are retreating. They call him Jochen among themselves, a familiarity that would be unthinkable in regular Wehrmacht units. But the SS is different. They're believers, and belief in war can overcome impossible odds. At least that's what they tell themselves. December 14th. Final commander's briefing at 6th SS Panzer Army Headquarters. General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, the Army commander, is direct. The offensive begins December 16th at 05:30. Artillery preparation will suppress American positions for 90 minutes. Your Kampfgruppe will spearhead the northern attack. Speed is everything. Bypass resistance where possible, destroy it when necessary, but keep moving. The Führer himself has reviewed this plan. Failure is not acceptable. Piper listens, nods, asks about fuel allocation. Dietrich's answer is evasive. Fuel will be captured from American depots, particularly the massive dumps around Stavelot and Spa. Piper does the mental calculation. His vehicles carry enough fuel for about 1.5 full tank loads, maybe 150 kilometers at combat speeds. Trois-Ponts is 60 kilometers from the start line. The Meuse is another 40 beyond that. The math doesn't work unless they capture fuel early and often. It's a gamble within a gamble, and for a moment Piper considers objecting, demanding more logistical support. Then he remembers what happened to officers who objected to the Ardennes plan. He salutes. We will reach the Meuse within 50 hours. The intelligence briefing is almost criminally optimistic. American forces in the Ardennes are described as second-rate. The 99th Infantry Division, green troops who've never seen combat. The 106th Infantry Division, exhausted veterans from other sectors. Scattered engineer and artillery battalions, filling gaps in the line. Opposition is expected to be disorganized, easily overwhelmed by concentrated armor and aggressive infiltration tactics. The briefing officer, a captain from military intelligence, points to Trois-Ponts on the map. Small town, limited garrison, bridges intact and undefended. The Belgian civilian population may actually welcome German forces after months of Allied occupation and bombing. Piper studies the aerial reconnaissance photos of Trois-Ponts, taken 2 weeks earlier. 3 bridges clearly visible, road conditions good, no evidence of fortifications or significant troop presence. It looks like a highway rest stop, not a defensive position. In his experience, the easiest-looking objectives often prove the hardest, but the intelligence seems solid. The Americans have no idea what's coming. December 15th, night. The Kampfgruppe is moving into assembly, positions under strict noise discipline. Tank crews perform final maintenance checks, loading ammunition and topping off fuel tanks with what little they've been allocated. Infantry squads clean weapons, sharpen knives, write final letters home that the field post will hold until the offensive is decided one way or another. Piper walks among his men, stopping to talk with tank commanders, sharing cigarettes with sergeants, projecting confidence he doesn't entirely feel. They're experienced soldiers, most of them. They've seen the Eastern Front meat grinder, survived the Allied breakout from Normandy, lived through the retreat across France that destroyed Army Group B's combat power. They know the war is lost strategically, that Germany is being crushed between Soviet and Allied armies, that even if this offensive succeeds tactically, it won't change the final outcome. But soldiers don't fight for strategic outcomes. They fight for their comrades, for their pride, for the hope that one more victory might buy time for a negotiated peace that saves their families from Soviet revenge. At midnight, Piper returns to his command half-track to review the route one final time. Losheim Gap to Hansfeld, 12 kilometers, expected American resistance minimal, estimated transit time 2 hours. Hansfeld to Bullingen, 8 kilometers, American fuel dump reported, must capture intact, transit time 1 hour. Bullingen to Ligneuville, 15 kilometers, mountainous terrain, narrow roads, transit time 3 hours. Ligneuville to Trois-Ponts, 12 kilometers, multiple river crossings including Amblève, critical phase, transit time 2 hours if bridges are intact. Trois-Ponts to Werbemont, 18 kilometers, open terrain begins, transit time 90 minutes. Werbemont to Huy, 32 kilometers, final approach to Meuse, bridgehead establishment, transit time 4 hours under ideal conditions. Total distance, 97 kilometers. Total timeline, 14 hours of movement, 36 hours of contingency for combat and delays. The margins are razor thin. A single destroyed bridge, one stubborn American defensive position, a company of tank destroyers in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any of these could derail the entire schedule. 4 o'clock in the morning, December 16th. The forest is silent except for the idle rumble of hundreds of engines warming up. Piper is in the turret of his command Panther, radio headset on, listening to reports from other Kampfgruppen along the attack front. To his south, Kampfgruppe Hansen and Kampfgruppe Sondig are also preparing to jump off, following parallel routes toward the Meuse. The plan calls for 3 simultaneous thrusts, overwhelming American defenses through sheer concentrated violence. But Peiper knows his route is the fastest, the most direct, the one most likely to achieve the breakthrough that changes everything. If he reaches the Meuse first, if he establishes a bridgehead before Allied reserves can react, the entire northern Allied front might collapse. British forces around Antwerp could be cut off. Montgomery's 21st Army Group might have to evacuate. At minimum, it would force Eisenhower to divert resources from the planned Rhine crossing, buying Germany months of additional resistance. Maximum outcome, a negotiated settlement that keeps Soviet forces east of the Oder River. It's a fantasy, probably, but wars are won by men willing to chase impossible goals. 5:29 in the morning, 1 minute until artillery preparation begins. Peiper can see nothing beyond his immediate surroundings, darkness, trees, the barely visible shapes of tanks arrayed behind him. Then, precisely on schedule, the horizon erupts. Thousands of German guns, from light mortars to massive railroad artillery pieces, open fire simultaneously along a 60-mile front. The barrage is intended to suppress American positions, destroy communications, create panic and confusion. It's the largest German artillery concentration on the Western Front since Normandy, proof that the Wehrmacht still has teeth despite the retreat across France. Peiper watches the flashes, counts seconds between flash and sound, judges the distance to impact zones. The plan is working. In 90 minutes, the barrage will lift, and his column will surge forward into whatever remains of American defenses. Trois-Ponts is 58 kilometers away, across terrain he's memorized but never seen. Somewhere in that Belgian town, if intelligence is correct, a handful of American engineers are sleeping, unaware that the Devil's Spearhead is coming for their bridges, unaware that they're about to become the hinge upon which history turns. The sky turns orange with muzzle flashes. In the distance, American positions begin to burn. And Joachim Peiper, 30 years old, believer in lost causes and master of armored warfare, gives the order his men have been waiting for. Forward! Don't stop for anything. December 17th, 1944, 12:30 in the afternoon. The convoy of American trucks rolls south through the Belgian countryside with the casual confidence of men who think the war has moved east. Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a unit nobody's ever heard of doing work, nobody understands. They're not frontline combat troops. They're technical specialists, forward observers who calculate firing coordinates for artillery batteries, equipped with radios and optical equipment and maps covered in grid references. 140 men riding in 30 trucks, heading from their base near Schievenhütte to a new position at St. Vith. It's supposed to be a routine redeployment, the kind of administrative movement that happens a dozen times a day across the Allied rear areas. Nobody warned them about the German offensive that began 24 hours ago. Nobody told them that the roads they're traveling are now behind enemy lines. And absolutely nobody mentioned that Kampfgruppe Peiper is racing west on a parallel route just a few miles north. The convoy commander is Captain Roger Mills, 32 years old, from Pennsylvania. He's riding in the lead vehicle, studying his map, trying to navigate the confusing network of Belgian country roads that all look identical in the December cold. They're approaching the Baugnez crossroads, a nothing intersection where the road from Malmedy meets the road south to Ligneuville. The plan is to turn south at Baugnez, continue to St. Vith, set up the new observation post by nightfall. Standard procedure. Behind Mills, the convoy stretches out. 30 trucks moving at cautious speed on icy roads, drivers focused on not sliding into ditches, passengers dozing or reading stars and stripes or writing letters home. Some of them heard rumors this morning about a German attack somewhere to the east, but rumors are constant in war. The brass says everything's under control. Besides, the weather is terrible, low clouds, freezing rain starting, which means no air activity from either side. Just another miserable day in Belgium. 12:45. The lead vehicles reach Baugnez crossroads and start to make the turn south. That's when the world explodes. German tanks appear from the north. Panthers and Mark IVs from Peiper's vanguard, guns already tracking the American column. The first shot takes the lead truck completely apart. Metal and bodies and equipment flung across the road in a spray of red and black. Chaos, instant and total. Trucks slamming into each other as drivers panic. Men jumping out, running for the ditches, throwing down weapons because you can't fight tanks with rifles. Some try to surrender immediately, hands up, shouting, "Kamerad!" in fractured German. Others run for the tree line, hoping to escape into the forest. The German response is methodical, machine gun fire cutting down the runners, tank cannons destroying. The trucks one by one, turning the convoy into a killing ground. The entire engagement lasts maybe 10 minutes. When it ends, 84 American soldiers are prisoners, standing in the snow-covered field adjacent to the crossroads, hands on their heads, surrounded by SS troops in winter camouflage. The prisoners huddle together for warmth and comfort, breath steaming in the frozen air. Most are scared, but not terrified. They're Piebesau, which means they'll sit out the rest of the war in a German camp. Better than dying in combat, better than another winter in foxholes. Some are injured from the initial assault, bleeding into the snow, while their buddies try to render first aid. The SS guards are young, many of them teenagers, with the hard faces of soldiers who've learned to stop seeing enemies as human beings. An officer, maybe a lieutenant, maybe a captain, survivors will later disagree, walks among the prisoners, studying them with expression that holds no mercy or hate, just cold assessment. The prisoners hear tank engines in the distance, more vehicles moving past on the road to Ligneville. Piper's column is continuing west, bypassing this minor incident, racing toward Trois-Ponts and the bridges that will decide his fate. The SS troops guarding the prisoners seem uncertain what to do. They can't spare men to guard 80 PU, can't spare vehicles to transport them, can't afford delays while the main column speeds ahead. 1:15 in the afternoon. An order is given. Survivors will spend the rest of their lives arguing about who gave it, what exact words were used, whether it came from Piper himself or a subordinate acting on initiative, but the result is unmistakable. SS troops form a line, machine guns aimed at the mass of prisoners packed together in the field. For a moment, maybe 5 seconds, nothing happens. The Americans realize what's about to occur. You can see it in their faces, the shift from confusion to understanding to horror. Some start to pray. Others curse. A few break and run, knowing it won't matter, but unable to just stand there. Then the machine guns open fire. The sound is mechanical, industrial, the ripping canvas noise of MG-42s cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute. Bodies falling into the snow, blood spreading in dark puddles that steam in the cold. The first volley kills maybe half of them. The rest scatter, slip, fall, try to hide under the corpses of their friends. The Germans walk among them, firing pistol shots into anyone who moves, who moans, who shows any sign of life, but some survive. Private Michael Saranko, hit in the leg but conscious, lies perfectly still under 2 dead bodies, barely breathing, listening to the boots crunching through snow as the Germans check for survivors. The execution lasts maybe 10 minutes. Then the SS troops return to their vehicles and depart, continuing their march west, leaving 84 bodies in the snow at Baugnez crossroads. Skaranko waits, 20 minutes, half frozen, certain he'll be discovered or bleed out. Then he crawls, inch by inch, dragging his shattered leg, moving toward the tree line, 200 yards away. Other survivors emerge from the pile of bodies, maybe a dozen men who played dead successfully, who weren't shot in the head during the execution. They help each other into the forest, moving away from the road, heading west toward what they hope are American lines. Behind them, the bodies lie in the snowfield, arms outstretched, faces frozen in final expressions, evidence of a war crime that will haunt the German military for generations. 2:30 in the afternoon. Skaranko and 6 other survivors reach American lines at Malmedy, bleeding and frostbitten and nearly incoherent. The news spreads like electricity through Allied units in the sector. SS troops are murdering prisoners. 84 Americans executed in a field. Piper's column is coming, and they're not taking prisoners. A master sergeant, the 30th Infantry Division passes the word to his men. No mercy for SS troops. You see those bastards, you kill them. Understand? Company commanders hold emergency briefings, warning their soldiers about the massacre, using it to stiffen resolve among men who might otherwise consider surrender when facing overwhelming odds. At Allied headquarters, staff officers are already taking statements from survivors, documenting evidence for future war crimes trials, but the immediate impact is psychological. The massacre transforms the coming battles from military operations into personal vendettas. By 3:45, the news reaches Trois-Ponts. Lieutenant Edelstein hears it from a military police runner who came through Malmedy an hour earlier. "It's Piper," the runner says, voice shaking. "He murdered them. Just lined them up and shot them. Women in Malmedy are talking about bodies in the snow, maybe 100 men." Edelstein feels something cold settle in his stomach. His engineers are preparing to defend 3 bridges against an SS commander who massacres prisoners. If they fail, if the Germans overrun their positions, there will be no surrender, no POW camp, just bullets in the snow. He gathers his platoon leaders, shares the information, watches their faces harden. "We hold those bridges," he says, "and we blow them when the time comes. This isn't about orders anymore. This is about survival." Outside, the sound of artillery grows closer, smoke visible on the eastern horizon. And somewhere on the road from Ligneville, Joachim Piper's column is advancing toward them, leaving a trail of blood and burned-out vehicles and murdered prisoners in the snow. The Malmedy Massacre, as it will be known, kills 84 American soldiers at Baugnes Crossroads. Another 43 managed to escape, wounded and traumatized. It's the largest single atrocity committed against American forces by German troops in the Western European theater. The massacre achieves nothing militarily. Piper gains no tactical advantage, captures no intelligence, secures no strategic position. If anything, it costs him time and ammunition and the moral authority that sometimes persuades enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. But it accomplishes something Piper doesn't intend. It hardens American resistance across the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge. Word spreads through infantry companies, tank destroyer battalions, artillery batteries, engineer platoons. The SS is coming, and they take no prisoners. Every American soldier who hears that message makes a calculation. Better to die fighting than to be murdered in a field. Better to blow that bridge early than risk capture. Better to hold that crossroad for 10 more minutes, buying time for reinforcements, than to retreat and face those machine guns. At Trois-Ponts, in the gathering December darkness, Company C engineers check their weapons and their detonators one last time. They know now what's coming. They know what happens if they fail. And they know that somewhere in that approaching column is an SS officer who murders prisoners without hesitation or remorse. The massacre at Baugnes is 8 miles away and 4 hours in the past, but its psychological impact reaches forward, transforming the mathematics of courage. These engineers aren't heroes. They're ordinary men, construction workers in uniform, bridge builders suddenly forced to be bridge destroyers. But now they're also survivors in waiting, men who understand that their only choice is to do their jobs perfectly, under fire, against impossible odds, or die trying. The blood in the snow at Baugnes Crossroads has eliminated every option except resistance. And Joachim Piper, racing toward those bridges, has no idea that his greatest tactical advantage, the fear his reputation creates, has just become his greatest liability. Because terrified men surrender, but men with no hope of mercy fight until they've got nothing left. December 17th, 1944. 7 o'clock in the morning. The mess hall at Trois-Ponts smells like powdered eggs and weak coffee, the standard American breakfast that soldiers complain about but eat anyway because hunger doesn't care about culinary standards. Private First Class Frank Ria sits at a wooden table, reading a letter from his wife in Ohio, trying to imagine what home feels like after 8 months in Europe. Around him, 60 engineers from Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, are eating and joking and planning their day. Routine bridge maintenance, checking culverts for ice damage, maybe clearing some roads if the snow gets worse. They're wearing wool uniforms and field jackets, not combat gear. They're carrying wrenches and measuring tapes, not extra ammunition, because they're engineers, not infantry. They build things, they fix things. Fighting is what happens to other units, other soldiers, other poor bastards who drew the short straw in the Army's vast lottery of assignments. Company C is a composite unit, assembled from replacement units and veterans and specialists who happen to end up in the same battalion. Major Robert Yates commands, a pre-war civil engineer from Michigan who joined in '41 and spent 2 years building airfields in England before the Normandy invasion. He's methodical, cautious, the kind of officer who triple-checks calculations before signing off on demolition plans. His second in command is Captain Sam Schuber, younger and more aggressive, a former construction foreman who treats engineering problems like personal challenges to be dominated rather than solved. The platoon leaders include Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein, who's got a degree in structural engineering from City College of New York and thinks in equations. Lieutenant Tom Stack, a farm kid from Iowa who learned explosives working in quarries, and Lieutenant Bucky Walters, the company's best poker player and worst disciplinarian, beloved by enlisted men for looking the other way when they scrounge extra rations from supply depots. The enlisted ranks are even more diverse. Sergeant Edwin Pigg grew up in West Virginia coal country, knows more about underground demolitions than most engineers learn in a lifetime. Corporal Vincent Consiglio is a Brooklyn native who can hotwire any vehicle and speaks enough French and German to talk to civilians and interrogate prisoners. Private First Class Lawrence Koenig is a farm equipment mechanic from Minnesota who keeps the company's trucks running on spare parts and prayer. Private Bernard Goldstein is a former rabbinical student from Philadelphia who carries a Torah portion in his helmet and never misses Shabbat prayers when circumstances allow. They're Americans, which means they're everything. Irish Catholics and Southern Baptists and Jews and Mormons and guys who haven't been to church since their mothers stopped forcing them. They're united by shared misery, by the bonds that form when you spend months living in close quarters, by the dark humor that soldiers use to process fear and boredom and the randomness of survival. Most of Company C landed in Normandy on D+30, part of the massive engineer effort to build the infrastructure that allowed Allied armies to drive across France. They cleared mines from Norman hedgerows, built Bailey bridges across the Seine, repaired roads cratered by German demolitions and Allied bombing. They watched infantry divisions advance while they stayed behind, doing the unglamorous work that keeps mechanized armies moving. They lost men. 3 killed by mines in August, 5 wounded in a German air raid in September, 2 dead from a truck accident in October. But they haven't been in sustained combat, haven't held defensive positions against armor, haven't experienced the particular terror of being outnumbered and outgunned with nowhere to retreat. They're veterans of engineering, operations, not battlefield survival, and that distinction is about to become critically important. Their training emphasized construction and demolition in that order. American combat engineers in the Second World War are multi-purpose specialists, expected to build bridges under fire, clear minefields under artillery bombardment, and blow up infrastructure when the tactical situation demands destruction rather than construction. They train with explosives, TNT, Composition C, shaped charges, cratering charges, everything needed to destroy roads, bridges, buildings, enemy fortifications. They train with small arms, enough to defend themselves and their work sites. But they're not trained for sustained infantry combat, not equipped with heavy weapons, not organized or led for defensive operations against armored forces. They've got M1 carbines, a few Browning automatic rifles, maybe 4 bazookas total for the entire company. Against tanks, they're supposed to rely on infantry or tank destroyer support. Except there is no support coming to Trois-Ponts. 10 o'clock in the morning, the first refugees start appearing, and the engineers know something's wrong. Belgian civilians don't abandon their homes for minor threats. When entire families are walking west with whatever they can carry, when farmers are leaving livestock behind, when old women are crying and speaking frantically in French about les Boches, the Germans, you know it's serious. Edelstein stops a middle-aged man pushing a cart loaded with suitcases and children. "What's happening? Why are you leaving?" The man's French is rapid, panicked, but Corporal Consiglio translates. "German tanks came through Stavelot this morning, hundreds of them. They're burning houses, killing anyone who resists. They shot some American soldiers who tried to surrender. His cousin saw it. The Germans are coming here next. They're coming now." Edelstein feels adrenaline spike through his system, that chemical rush that sharpens senses and accelerates time. He sends a runner to Major Yates, continues to the bridge where his platoon is working. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, official orders arrive via radio from 1st Army headquarters, relayed through divisional command. All bridges in the sector to be prepared for immediate demolition, enemy offensive confirmed, defensive positions to be established. Major Yates calls his officers together in the schoolhouse that serves as Company CP. The briefing is short because intelligence is fragmentary. Large German armored force broke through at Losheim Gap. Multiple American units overrun. Enemy advancing west at high speed. Estimated strength unknown. Estimated arrival time unknown. Mission: defend Trois-Ponts bridges, delay enemy advance, destroy bridges if capture appears imminent. Reinforcements: none available. All reserves committed to containing multiple German thrusts. Questions: none, because what is there to ask? You're being ordered to fight, panzers with rifles. You're being told to hold a position that higher command considers expendable as long as those bridges are destroyed. Questions won't change the mission. Edelstein returns to his platoon with orders that transform them from construction workers into combat troops. We're rigging all 3 bridges for demolition. Amblev, Salm, railroad viaduct. Full charges, electrical detonators, backup time fuses, manual igniters as third-line safety. Assume we'll have to blow them under fire. Defensive positions in the buildings overlooking the approaches. Bazookas to cover the main roads. Machine guns at windows. We hold until ordered to destroy the bridges, then we blow them and withdraw west. The men stare at him, processing this. Private Rhea raises his hand like they're in a classroom. Sir, are we getting infantry support? Tank destroyers? Edelstein shakes his head. We're it. Division has nothing to send. Every unit is committed. It's us or nobody. Silence settles. Over the platoon. Someone mutters "fuck" under his breath. Someone else laughs, high and slightly hysterical. Sergeant Pig spits tobacco juice into the dirt and says what they are all thinking. Well, shit. Guess we better get those charges placed right. The work begins with urgency, but without panic. These men know their jobs. They've been training for this exact mission, albeit in peaceful circumstances with instructors grading their performance, rather than enemy tanks approaching. They break out the demolitions from the warehouse. Wooden crates stenciled with TNT markings, electrical blasting caps wrapped in protective cloth, spools of detonation wire, battery-powered firing devices. The Amblev bridge requires the most explosive. Its stone construction is solid, built to last centuries, requiring 900 pounds of TNT placed precisely against the center support columns. The Salm bridge is lighter, steel trusses that will collapse if the main beams are cut, needing 400 pounds. The railroad viaduct is smaller but tricky, stone pillars that must be destroyed at their bases to drop the superstructure. Edelstein does the calculations in his field notebook, cross-referencing the standard demolition tables from the engineer manual, adjusting for stone density and support thickness and the fact that they might have to detonate under incoming fire. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as winter darkness falls early over the Ardennes, the charges are set and the firing circuits tested. 3 bridges, 3 separate detonation systems, each with triple redundancy in case primary systems fail. Engineers take up defensive positions. Squads in houses overlooking the bridge approaches, riflemen at windows, bazooka men in cellars where they can fire through ground-level openings. It's not a proper defensive position by infantry standards. They don't have fields of fire, interlocking zones, pre-planned artillery support. They're making it up as they go, using common sense and basic tactics and the knowledge that their job isn't to win a battle. It's to buy time. Enough time to blow those bridges before German armor crosses them. That's the whole mission. Everything else is just delay and sacrifice, and hope that when the moment comes, the detonators work, and the math was correct, and 140 engineers can hold off 4,000 SS troops long enough to do the one thing that matters. Outside, the rumble of artillery grows closer. Inside, men check their weapons for the 10th time and try not to think about what 84 murdered prisoners looked like in the snow at Malmedy. December 17th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning. Joachim Piper stands in the turret of his command Panther, watching his fuel gauges drop with the steady inevitability of a death sentence. The offensive is barely 24 hours old, and already the numbers are telling him what he doesn't want to believe. They're running out of time measured in liters of gasoline. His column has covered 50 kilometers since jumping off yesterday morning, smashing through American positions at Losheim Gap, overrunning Hansfeld, bypassing resistance at Bullingen. The advance has been everything Berlin promised. rapid, violent, shocking in its success. But success consumes fuel. Every kilometer driven, every engine idling in traffic jams, every tank maneuvering off-road to bypass obstacles, it all drains the tanks that were only 60% full when they started. The fuel gauges read 40% now, maybe less on the vehicles at the rear of the column, and Piper has covered barely half the distance to the Meuse River. The fuel situation was supposed to solve itself. German planning relied on a simple assumption. American logistics in the Ardennes sector were fat and lazy, with massive fuel depots scattered across Belgium to supply the Allied advance into Germany. Intelligence identified specific targets, 50 saws, 1,000 gallons here, 100,000 there, enough to refuel the Kampfgruppe multiple times on its drive to the Meuse. Capture those depots intact, and fuel becomes a non-issue. Miss them, or find them destroyed, and the offensive stalls 50 kilometers short of its objective, leaving the entire 6th SS Panzer Army stranded in enemy territory with dry tanks. It's logistics as strategy, and Piper hates it, because logistics is where optimistic plans go to die. He's fought in Russia. He knows what happens when supply lines stretch beyond breaking point, when promised fuel doesn't arrive, when armored divisions become immobile targets waiting for enemy artillery to find their coordinates. Hansfeld delivers the first fuel depot, but it's smaller than expected. American forces evacuated most of the stocks before Piper's vanguard arrived, leaving behind maybe 20,000 gallons, enough for one refueling of his lead elements, nothing more. His tankers work frantically, pumping American gasoline into German vehicles while the column stacks up on the narrow roads. Hundreds of vehicles packed nose to tail, vulnerable to air attack if the weather clears. The process takes 2 hours. 2 hours that weren't in the timeline, 2 hours that push his arrival at Trois-Ponts from late afternoon to early evening. But what choice does he have? Vehicles without fuel don't advance. They become roadblocks, obstacles that his following units must push aside or abandon. So he waits, fumes, watches the sky nervously for breaks in the cloud cover that would bring American fighter bombers. The weather holds, low clouds, freezing rain, visibility measured in hundreds of meters. It's the only thing working in his favor. By 10:30, the column is moving again, heading west toward Bullingen, where intelligence promises a larger depot, at least 50,000 gallons, possibly more. But Bullingen proves a bitter disappointment. The Americans, now aware of the German offensive, and reacting with the pragmatic brutality that characterizes their military operations, have destroyed most of the fuel stocks. Piper's engineers find storage tanks riddled with small arms fire, fuel soaking into frozen ground, the chemical smell overwhelming. What remains is barely 50,000 gallons, and it's aviation fuel for aircraft, not the higher octane gasoline that German tanks require. His maintenance officers debate whether mixing aviation fuel with their remaining stocks will damage engines. The consensus is maybe, probably, but what alternative exists? They take it. They take everything. Fuel, rations, ammunition, medical supplies, anything that might sustain the advance. And while they're looting American logistics, the clock continues its merciless advance. Noon becomes 1 o'clock, becomes 2 o'clock, and Piper is still 30 kilometers from Trois-Ponts. The route itself compounds every delay. Rollbahn D looked perfect on maps, a road network connecting villages in a straight line from Losheim Gap to the Meuse. Reality is narrow Belgian country roads never designed for armored columns, passing through villages with tight turns and stone buildings that channel traffic into choke points. Piper's column stretches out over 15 kilometers now, from his lead panthers approaching Ligneville to his rear guard still clearing resistance near Bullingen. Command and control becomes increasingly difficult. Radio communications are spotty in the forested hills. Runners take hours to travel the length of the column. Orders get garbled. Units take wrong turns. Traffic jams develop that require officers to physically direct traffic like police managing a city intersection. This isn't the blitzkrieg that conquered France in 1940. This is brutal improvisation against an enemy that refuses to collapse on schedule, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Piper receives a radio message from 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters that changes everything. Weather forecast shows clearing conditions by tomorrow morning, December 18th. Clear skies mean American air superiority returns. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs orbiting over the Ardennes, hunting for German armor with bombs and rockets and 50 caliber machine guns that turn tanks into coffins. Daylight movement will become suicidal, which means Piper has maybe 16 hours, from now until dawn tomorrow, to reach the Meuse and establish a bridgehead strong enough to survive air attack. 16 hours to cover 40 kilometers through unknown terrain with uncertain fuel supplies against American forces that are finally waking up to the threat. The mathematics are brutal. Even under ideal conditions, no resistance, no delays, straight roads, and cooperative weather, it would be difficult. Under actual conditions, it's approaching impossible. But approaching impossible is different from impossible, and Piper has built a career on doing what others consider unfeasible. He issues new orders, bypass all resistance, engage only when absolutely necessary, maintain speed above all else. If American units block the road, go around them. If villages defend themselves, leave infantry to clear them while armor continues forward. The objective is the Meuse River, not tactical victories in Belgian crossroads. Everything else is distraction. His tank commanders acknowledge the orders with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some understand the urgency, the need for speed over security. Others worry about exposing their flanks, about outrunning their supply lines, about advancing into potential ambushes. Piper overrides all objections. We reach the Meuse or we die trying. Those are the only options. Understood? The radio crackles with affirmatives. Verstanden, jawohl. The column accelerates. 4:15. The fuel mathematics become unavoidable. Piper does the calculation in his head, cross-checking against the gauges visible from his turret. Current fuel state, approximately 35% across the entire Kampfgruppe, with significant variation. Some vehicles at 40%, others dangerously close to 20. Distance to Trois-Ponts, 12 kilometers. Distance from Trois-Ponts to Meuse, 42 kilometers. Total, 54 kilometers remaining. Fuel consumption at combat speed in mountainous terrain, approximately 1 full tank per 100 kilometers, which means he needs roughly 50% of a tank to reach the Meuse. He has 35%. The deficit is obvious. Unless he captures more American fuel, a lot more, at least another 50,000 gallons, the offensive ends somewhere between Trois-Ponts and the Meuse. His tanks will run dry, his half-tracks will coast to a stop, and 4,000 SS troops will be stranded in enemy territory, surrounded by Allied forces, waiting for the artillery and airstrikes that will methodically destroy them. Everything now depends on Trois-Ponts. Not just the bridges, though those are critical for maintaining speed and avoiding lengthy detours, but the town itself, which intelligence reports sits near American supply routes from Liège. There might be fuel depots, there might be supply convoys, there might be something, anything that allows the offensive to continue. Piper studies his maps, measuring distances with his fingers, calculating contingencies. If Trois-Ponts yields nothing, he'll have to push south towards Stavelot, where other intelligence reports suggest fuel dumps. But that's a detour, more time lost, more fuel consumed searching for fuel. The irony isn't lost on him. Germany's final offensive in the West, personally approved by Hitler, dependent on stolen American gasoline because the Wehrmacht's own logistics system has collapsed under years of attrition. He remembers Russia, remembers Tiger tanks abandoned beside roads because there was no fuel to move them, no tractors to tow them, nothing but retreat and yawl. Destruction and the slow realization that industrial warfare favors the side with functioning factories and secure supply lines. 5 o'clock, darkness falling. The column approaches Ligneville, last village before Trois-Ponts. Piper can see smoke on the horizon, probably from American artillery interdicting roads or villages burning from earlier combat. Radio traffic indicates his vanguard is encountering increased resistance. American troops who've had time to establish hasty defensive positions, who aren't running anymore, who understand that every hour of delay weakens the German thrust. He orders his lead elements to smash through, no stopping, no mercy, just speed and violence overwhelming whatever fragmented defense the Americans have managed to organize. The Panthers accelerate, machine guns opening fire, high explosive rounds blasting buildings that might conceal anti-tank weapons. It's not careful tactics. It's armored sledgehammer work, trading ammunition for time, betting that shock and aggression will paralyze American resistance long enough for the column to pass through. And it works, mostly. Ligneville falls in 30 minutes of brutal close-quarters combat. but it costs fuel. Fuel consumed in street fighting, in accelerating and braking and maneuvering through narrow lanes. And it costs time. Another hour gone. Another hour closer to dawn when American aircraft return. Piper checks his watch. 17:30 hours. 5:30 in the afternoon. Trois-Ponts is 8 kilometers west. If the bridges are intact, if American resistance is minimal, if fuel can be found somewhere in that town, he might reach the Meuse by midnight. Might establish a bridgehead before dawn. Might achieve the breakthrough that justifies this entire desperate offensive. But every minute of delay reduces probability. Every liter of fuel consumed narrows options. Every kilometer traveled stretches his column thinner. He's won the tactical engagement so far, but he's losing the logistical race. And in modern warfare, logistics eventually defeats tactics. The question is whether eventually comes before or after he reaches those bridges at Trois-Ponts. In 90 minutes, he'll have his answer. The column moves west into gathering darkness, engines roaring, fuel gauges dropping, toward a crossroads town that neither side planned for, but both sides now need desperately. History is a race sometimes, and Joachim Piper is running out of fuel. December 17th, 1944, 2:30 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein kneels beside the center support pillar of the Amblev Bridge, running calculations in his field notebook with the focused intensity of a student taking final exams. Except the stakes here are somewhat higher than a grade. Get the math wrong, and the bridge survives German assault. Get it right, and 900 pounds of TNT will drop 50 tons of stone into the river, creating an impassable gap that stops an armored column. The engineering is straightforward in theory. Place sufficient explosive at structural weak points to overcome the compressive strength of masonry construction and gravity. In practice, it's complicated by variables his textbooks never covered. Bridges built in 1842 with construction techniques that varied from modern standards, stone of uncertain composition and density, support pillars that might contain internal voids or reinforcement, and the small detail that he'll need to detonate these charges while German tanks are shooting at him. The bridge is a beautiful piece of 19th century engineering, 5 stone arches spanning 190 feet across the Amblev River. Each arch transfers load through voussoir stones arranged in compression, the classic Roman technique that's kept bridges standing for millennia. The center supports, the pillars rising from the riverbed to hold the arches, are the critical vulnerability. Destroy those pillars, and the arches collapse under their own weight, dropping the roadbed into the water. Leave the pillars intact, and the bridge will absorb explosive damage, maybe crack some stones, but remain fundamentally sound. German engineers could repair superficial damage in hours, throw down a temporary roadbed, keep the offensive moving. Edelstein needs catastrophic structural failure, not cosmetic damage, which means precise charge placement based on accurate calculations of stone strength, pillar dimensions, and explosive force. He measures the pillars with a tape measure, 11 feet wide, 8 feet deep, approximately 30 feet from foundation to roadbed. Solid stone construction, no visible cracks or deterioration. Strong, very strong. The explosive available is military-grade TNT, trinitro-toluene, the standard demolition charge in every army since the First World War. Each stick weighs 1 pound, contains approximately 1 million joules of energy, and produces expanding gases that create pressure waves capable of shattering stone and steel. The engineering manuals provide tables for calculating required charges, bridge span, material type, desired effect. For complete destruction of stone arch bridges, the formula recommends approximately 5 pounds of TNT per cubic foot of support material to be destroyed. Edelstein calculates pillar volume, 11 feet by 8 feet by 30 feet equals 2,640 cubic feet. Times 5 pounds per cubic foot equals 13,200 pounds of TNT. He stares at that number, recalculates, gets the same result. They don't have 13,000 pounds. They have maybe 3,000 pounds total for all 3 bridges. The manual tables assume total destruction, vaporizing pillars, leaving no trace. But he doesn't need total destruction. He needs structural failure. He revises the calculation using minimum effective charge weights, aiming for critical damage rather than complete. Elimination. Focus the explosive on the pillar's base where stress concentrations are highest, where removing 10% of material might cause 90% structural collapse. Plant charges in drilled holes to concentrate force rather than surface explosions that waste energy blasting air. Use shaped charges if possible, focusing blast waves directionally. The new calculation: 900 pounds of TNT placed in holes drilled into the base of the center support pillars. 2 pillars targeted to create maximum span loss. It's borderline adequate. If the stone is weaker than estimated, 900 pounds will work. If it's stronger, or if the charges aren't placed perfectly, the bridge might survive with repairable damage. He's making educated guesses based on incomplete information, betting lives and strategic outcomes on calculations that contain significant uncertainty margins. Welcome to combat engineering. 3 o'clock. The drilling begins. Sergeants Pig and Koenig are directing teams with pneumatic drills, boring holes into stone that resists like it's personally offended by the effort. The drills are powered by a portable compressor running off a truck engine, loud enough that everyone in Trois-Ponts can hear the engineering work in progress. Each hole needs to be approximately 3 feet deep, 6 inches in diameter, angled slightly upward to contain the explosive charge. The stone is dense, probably limestone with high compression strength, which is good for bridge integrity but terrible for drilling speed. Each hole takes 40 minutes, and they need multiple holes per pillar to distribute the explosive evenly. The work is physically exhausting. Soldiers taking turns on the drills, arms vibrating from the pneumatic hammers, hands going numb in the December cold. Belgian civilians watch from windows, understanding what this means. The Americans are preparing to destroy the bridge, which means the Germans are coming, which means the war that seems safely distant is about to arrive in their town. 4 o'clock. The drilling complete, the explosive placement begins. This is delicate work, requiring precision and steady hands and the knowledge that you're manhandling high explosives that could detonate if mishandled. TNT is relatively stable. You can drop it, light it on fire, even shoot it without causing detonation. But attach a blasting cap, introduce an electrical current or shock wave, and it becomes violently unstable. Edelstein supervises personally, watching as engineers lower canvas bags filled with TNT sticks into the drilled holes, packing the charges tight with wooden tamping rods, ensuring no air gaps that would waste explosive force. Each charge bundle is wired with electrical blasting caps, small cylindrical detonators that convert electrical current into the shock wave needed to initiate TNT. The blasting caps are sensitive, susceptible to stray electrical currents, static electricity, even rough handling. One engineer tells a story about a blasting cap that detonated in a guy's hand during training, took off 3 fingers, turned his hand into hamburger. Everyone becomes very, very careful. The wiring is redundant by design, learning from failures earlier in the war where single-point electrical systems failed when German fire cut the detonation wires. Edelstein runs 3 separate circuits: primary electrical firing system using battery-powered detonators, backup time delay fuses that burn at known rates and trigger secondary detonators, and manual ignition charges that can be lit with a match if everything else fails. Each circuit connects to multiple blasting caps per charge bundle, ensuring that even if some caps fail, others will detonate successfully. The wires snake from the bridge pillars to a firing position 200 yards away, protected inside a building where the detonator operator can observe the bridge and choose the exact moment of destruction. It's belt and suspenders engineering, multiple redundancies compensating for battlefield chaos. Because if the primary system fails, if the bridge survives that first detonation attempt, there won't be time for a second try. German tanks will be across. 4:45. Testing the circuits becomes the most nerve-wracking part of the entire operation. Edelstein disconnects the blasting caps, substitutes test resistors, runs electrical current through each circuit to verify continuity. The equipment is standard U.S. Army issue: battery-powered firing devices, multimeter for checking resistance, color-coded wires to prevent confusion under stress. First circuit, continuity good, resistance within normal range. Second circuit, continuity good. Third circuit, nothing. The multimeter shows infinite resistance, meaning a break somewhere in the hundreds of yards of wire running from firing position to bridge. Edelstein traces the circuit, finds the break near a stone wall where a wire abraded. through insulation and grounded against metal rebar. He repairs it with electrical tape, retests, continuity good. He feels sweat cooling on his back despite the December cold. If they'd discovered that failure during the actual detonation attempt, with German tanks 200 yards away, the bridge would have survived, and Company C would probably have died trying to defend it. The Somme Bridge receives similar treatment, though the engineering is different. Steel truss construction instead of stone arches, which means targeting the main support beams rather than pillars. 400 pounds of TNT placed against the critical structural members where beams transfer load to the foundations. Cut those members, and the superstructure collapses like a house of cards. The railroad viaduct is the trickiest. Stone pillars supporting rails 30 feet above ground level, narrow enough that even partial damage will drop the tracks. 600 pounds spread across 3 pillars, insurance, against failure. By 5:15, all 3 bridges are prepared for demolition. Over 2,000 pounds of TNT placed in calculated positions, wired with triple redundancy, tested and verified. Edelstein walks the circuit one final time, checking connections, ensuring the canvas coverings that protect charges from rain are secure, confirming that the firing positions are manned and the operators understand their orders. Detonate on command or on own initiative if German forces are within 100 yards of the bridges. No hesitation. No waiting for clarification. Blow the bridges and trust that command will understand. The technical work is complete. Now comes the waiting, the psychological endurance test that every soldier knows. You've done everything possible to prepare. You've calculated, drilled, placed, wired, tested, verified. The explosives are ready. The defensive positions are manned. The bazookas are loaded. The machine guns are positioned. The rifles are cleaned and checked. There's nothing left to do except wait for the enemy to arrive and discover whether your preparations were sufficient. Edelstein returns to the company CP, reports to Major Yates that all bridges are prepared for demolition. Estimated destruction, probability 90% or higher, assuming charges detonate successfully. Yates nods, marks the information in his log, asks the question that has no good answer. How long can we hold before we have to blow them? Edelstein considers terrain, fields of fire, the handful of bazookas versus an armored column. Minutes, sir. Once they're in range, we'll have minutes at most, maybe less. Outside, the sound of engines, not their engines, heavier, deeper, coming from the east. The engineers check their weapons one final time and wait for the science of destruction to become the reality of combat. December 17th, 1944, 5:30 in the afternoon. Obergefreiter Hans Hennecke sits in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, leading the vanguard of Kampfgruppe Piper, watching the Belgian countryside roll past in the gathering darkness. The column has been moving almost continuously for 36 hours. Combat, movement, brief halts for fuel and ammunition, more movement. Hennecke is 22 years old, feels 50, with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen the Eastern Front meat grinder and survived through combination of skill and luck. His Panther is 6th in the column, close enough to the lead that he'll see action immediately, far enough back that maybe someone else will trigger the ambush if there is one. The road descends into a valley, forest-covered hills rising on both sides, a river visible ahead. According to the map, that's the Amblève, which means the town coming into view is Trois-Ponts, which means they're almost through the worst terrain, almost to open country, where Panthers can maneuver and German armor superiority matters. Another 30 kilometers to the Yar, Meuse, maybe 6 hours if resistance is light. Hennecke allows himself to imagine, if they make it, if they establish a bridgehead, maybe the war turns, maybe the Americans sue for peace, maybe he goes home to Hamburg and finds his family still alive. Maybe. The column crests a low hill, and Trois-Ponts appears below, a typical Belgian village of stone houses and narrow streets, unremarkable except for the river crossings. Hennecke can see the main bridge clearly. Stone arch construction, 5 spans, intact and apparently undefended. No roadblocks visible, no anti-tank guns positioned, no obvious sign of American forces. The lead Panther accelerates, commander probably thinking the same thing Hennecke is thinking. Empty town, straight shot across, maintain speed and momentum. The radio crackles with Piper's voice, harsh and urgent even through static. All units, maximum speed through Trois-Ponts. Do not stop. Do not engage unless fired upon. Maintain column integrity. The orders are consistent with everything they've done since jump-off. Bypass resistance, keep moving. The objective is the moves, not tactical victories in crossroads towns. The column accelerates, panthers and half-tracks and infantry carriers surging forward, engines roaring, tracks chewing frozen ground. 5:35. Private First Class Frank Ria is positioned in the second floor of a house overlooking the main approach to the Amblève Bridge, watching through a window with his M1 carbine at the ready. He sees them coming, first one tank, then another, then dozens more stretching back into the darkness, a column of armor that seems endless from his vantage point. His hands are shaking. He's never seen German tanks this close, never been in direct combat, never had to make life or death decisions in seconds. Beside him, Sergeant Pig is calmer, studying the approaching armor with the professional interest of someone who knows exactly how bad this is. Panthers, Pig says quietly. See the slope on the armor? That's Panther Glass's plating, damn near impervious to anything we've got. Bazookas might penetrate the sides or rear. Frontal shot is waste of ammunition. Ria processes this information, realizes that the 4 bazookas Company C possesses are their only chance of stopping or even slowing this assault. Everything else, rifles, machine guns, grenades, is essentially irrelevant against armored vehicles. The lead Panther reaches the edge of town, perhaps 400 yards from the bridge. Ria can see the commander in the turret cupola, binoculars to his eyes, studying the town. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happens. The Germans are assessing, deciding whether to proceed at speed or slow down and clear the town systematically. Those 10 seconds are critical. They're the window where American engineers can demonstrate that Trois-Ponts isn't empty, that crossing this bridge will cost blood and time and vehicles. Lieutenant Edelstein, positioned 3 buildings away with a field telephone connected to Major Yates, makes a decision that's simultaneously tactical and psychological. He picks up the telephone. All positions, commence fire, hit the lead vehicles, slow them down, make them think we're stronger than we are. The word passes through the defensive positions in seconds. And then Company C, 140 combat engineers armed with small arms in desperation, opens fire on an SS Panzer column. The first bazooka round launches from a basement firing position, rocket motor igniting with the characteristic whoosh bang that announces anti-tank weapons. The projectile crosses 400 yards in 2 seconds, impacts the lead Panther's right track assembly, explodes in a flash of orange and black smoke. The tank lurches, track severed, mobility killed, but armor intact. The Panther isn't destroyed, its crew is probably alive, its main gun still functional, but it's disabled, blocking the narrow street, forcing following vehicles to halt or maneuver around it, which is exactly what Edelstein hoped for. Delay. Force them to slow down, deploy infantry, clear houses, all time-consuming activities that give engineers more minutes to prepare the bridge demolition. The American fire intensifies, rifle bullets sparking off German armor, machine guns raking the infantry riding on half-tracks, a second bazooka round striking a Mark IV tank and penetrating the thinner side armor, internal ammunition cooking off in a sympathetic detonation that turns the vehicle into a funeral pyre. The German response is immediate and overwhelming. Panther main guns traverse toward muzzle flashes, 75mm high explosive rounds, blasting through Belgian stone walls like they're paper. The house where Ria is positioned takes a direct hit, the explosion turning the first floor into rubble, ceiling collapsing, dust and smoke choking the air. Ria and Pig scramble for the stairs, ears ringing from overpressure, barely registering that they're alive. Behind them, 2 engineers aren't, caught in the blast radius, buried under masonry, dead before they understood what happened. The return fire is methodical, professional, the product of a military that's been perfecting armored warfare for 5 years. Machine guns sweep buildings where defenders might hide. High explosive rounds crater walls. Smoke rounds create obscuration for infantry to advance. This isn't a meeting engagement between equal forces. This is a trained mechanized unit destroying isolated pockets of resistance. But the resistance, however overmatched, is buying time. 5:45. 10 minutes since first contact, and the German column is stalled in the approaches to Trois-Ponts. Tanks jockeying for position, infantry dismounting to clear buildings, Company-level chaos as units try to coordinate in urban terrain they haven't rehearsed. Henneke's Panther is fifth in line now, 2 vehicles disabled ahead of him, others maneuvering around destroyed tanks, the orderly column transformed into a traffic jam under fire. He can see the bridge clearly, maybe 300 yards away, stone arches intact and tantalizingly close. If they can just push through this resistance, cross that bridge, the offensive continues. But every minute of delay costs fuel, costs surprise, costs the momentum that armored warfare depends on. He fires his machine gun at a window where he saw muzzle flash, sees tracers punch through wood shutters, doesn't know if he hit anything. The main gun fires, the concussion enormous inside the tank, barrel recoiling as another Belgian house transforms into rubble. 6:10. The firefight has been raging for 35 minutes, and the Germans are winning through simple application of superior firepower. American defensive positions are being systematically destroyed, buildings collapsed by tank fire, machine gun nests silenced, engineers killed or forced to withdraw to secondary, positions farther from the bridge. The bazooka teams are down to 2 operational launchers, the other 2 destroyed with their crews. Casualty reports reaching Edelstein are fragmentary but grim. 8 dead, 14 wounded, defensive perimeter contracting. The Germans are 200 yards from the bridge now, advancing behind armor, using Panthers as mobile fortifications while infantry leapfrogs forward. Standard combined arms tactics, executed with the competence of veteran units. Against properly equipped American infantry with tank destroyer support, this assault would stall or fail. Against one company of combat engineers with small arms, it's a slow-motion massacre. Edelstein is on the field telephone with Major Yates, shouting over the sound of explosions. "They're breaking through, 200 yards and closing. I need permission to blow the bridge." Yates's voice comes back, distorted by poor connection and stress. "Not yet. Division says hold as long as possible. Every minute matters." Edelstein wants to scream. That division isn't here, isn't watching engineers die buying minutes for some strategic calculus happening at headquarters. But discipline holds. "Understood, we'll hold." He drops the telephone, grabs his M1 carbine, moves to a window overlooking the bridge approach. German infantry are visible now, maybe 150 yards, advancing in short rushes, using ruins for cover. A Panther swivels its turret toward his position. Edelstein ducks as the wall above him explodes, stone fragments cutting his face, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth. This is it. This is the moment where calculations and engineering and preparation meet the chaos of combat, where men make impossible decisions in seconds. 6:45. German infantry are 100 yards from the bridge, maybe less. Close enough that Edelstein can see individual soldiers, can distinguish SS camouflage smocks from Wehrmacht gray, can count the seconds until they reach the bridge approach, and his mission fails catastrophically. He grabs the field telephone one more time, no longer requesting permission, but stating intent. Blowing the bridge now, can't hold any longer. He doesn't wait for Yates to respond. He turns to Corporal Consiglio, who's manning the electrical detonator, a simple device with a plunger and battery pack. "On my command." Consiglio nods, hands on the plunger, eyes locked on Edelstein. Outside, German infantry are running now, final sprint toward the bridge, officers screaming orders, tanks accelerating to provide covering fire. The moment condenses to perfect clarity. Blow it now and save the mission, wait 10 more seconds and maybe kill more Germans who reach the bridge approach. Edelstein makes the calculation that 22-year-old engineering lieutenants shouldn't have to make. He thinks about 8 dead engineers buying these minutes. He thinks about the massacre at Malmedy. He thinks about 90 seconds. And then, he shouts the words that change everything. Blow it now. December 17th, 1944, 6:47 in the afternoon. Corporal Vincent Consiglio's hands close around the detonator plunger with the grip of someone about to change history. The device is simple, a metal handle connected to a spring-loaded generator that will produce the electrical current needed to trigger blasting caps 200 yards away. Simple, reliable, except when it isn't. Except when wires fail or batteries die, or some random variable prevents the circuit from completing. Consiglio has tested this device 3 times in the last 2 hours, verified continuity, checked connections. But tests don't account for German artillery that might have severed wires, for moisture that might have compromised connections, for the 1,000 small failures that turn perfect preparation into catastrophic malfunction. He looks at Lieutenant Edelstein, sees the terror and determination in equal measure, understands that everything, the entire defensive operation, the lives of Company C, maybe the outcome of the northern German offensive, depends on whether this detonator works when he pushes this plunger. Outside the window, German infantry are visible on the bridge approach, 60 meters away, running full sprint. Edelstein screams, "Now!" and Consiglio slams the plunger down with both hands, driving it to full compression, feeling the generator kick as spring tension converts to electrical current. For one eternal second, nothing happens. The circuit is completing, electrons racing through copper wire at near light speed, traveling 200 yards to the bridge, reaching the first blasting cap, creating the spark that initiates the shock-sensitive explosive compound inside the detonator. But human perception experiences that microsecond as delay, as failure, as the sickening realization that maybe it didn't work. Consiglio is already reaching to reset the plunger for a second attempt when the world that transforms into noise and light and physics unleashed at industrial scale. 900 pounds of TNT detonate simultaneously in the drilled holes at the base of the Amblev Bridge's center support pillars. The explosion is not Hollywood pyrotechnics, not a neat fireball that conveniently destroys exactly what needs destroying. It's the violent conversion of solid explosive into expanding gas at 7,000 meters per second, creating pressure waves that exceed atmospheric pressure by factors of thousands. Force measured not in pounds, but in millions of foot-pounds of kinetic energy focused against 19th century stone masonry. The initial shockwave is supersonic, faster than sound, propagating through stone before the roar of detonation reaches human ears. The bridge pillars, 11 feet wide, 8 feet deep, 30 feet tall, built to support centuries of traffic, shatter like glass under hammer impact. 2,000-pound stone blocks that took masons months to quarry and place are flung outward by explosive force, some landing in the river 50 feet away, others tumbling onto the roadbed above, kinetic chaos operating under Newton's laws, but at scales that make prediction impossible. The center span, suddenly unsupported, hangs in space for maybe half a second. Gravity not yet overcome, structural integrity not yet failed, a 60-ton section of roadbed and stone arch momentarily defying physics. Then reality asserts itself. The arch stones, held in compression by their mutual arrangement, lose that compression when the support pillars vanish. Without compression, stone has minimal tensile strength. It crumbles rather than bends. The center arch collapses inward, falling as a relatively intact section for the first 20 feet, then disintegrating into individual stones that tumble separately. The roadbed follows, cobblestones and soil, and the iron railings installed in 1920 erupting upward from the initial shockwave before falling into the Amblev River, with impacts that send water geysers 30 feet into the winter air. The entire collapse sequence takes perhaps 3 seconds from detonation to final settlement. When the dust begins to clear, there is a 65-foot gap where the center bridge span existed, stone debris piled in the riverbed, the current already working to redistribute the rubble. Hennecke, in his Panther 200 yards from the bridge, experiences the detonation as physical assault. The shockwave hits his tank before the sound registers, a pressure pulse that makes the 45-ton vehicle rock on its suspension, that slaps his face like an open-handed strike, that momentarily disrupts his vestibular system so the world spins despite his sitting still. Then the sound arrives, not a single bang but a rolling concussion that seems to originate everywhere simultaneously, that resonates in his chest cavity, that leaves his ears ringing with the high-pitched whine of temporary hearing damage. He's too experienced to panic, too well-trained to freeze, but for 5 seconds his brain simply processes input without forming coherent response. Bridge gone, mission failed, offensive stalled. The thoughts queue up like computer instructions, factual and stripped of emotion, because emotion is a luxury soldiers can't afford in crisis. The SS infantry who were 60 meters from the bridge when it detonated experienced something more visceral than tactical disappointment. The nearest man, Stormann Heinrich Voss, age 19 from Bavaria, is caught by the edge of the shockwave's lethal radius, the overpressure wave that exceeds human physiological tolerance. His organs hemorrhage, his eardrums rupture, His brain experiences traumatic injury from sudden pressure differential. He's dead before his body hits the frozen ground, killed by invisible force that leaves no visible wound. 3 others are injured by debris, stone fragments, traveling at ballistic velocities, shrapnel that breaks bones and severs arteries. The rest drop flat instinctively, the combat veterans' response to explosions, protecting themselves from secondary effects, even as their mission objective literally falls apart in front of them. When they raise their heads, they see what Piper will shortly see, an impassable gap where their route to the Meuse existed. Joachim Piper receives the report via radio at 6:50, 3 minutes after detonation. He's in his command half-track, positioned a quarter-mile behind the lead elements, monitoring tactical radio frequencies, when his vanguard commander's voice comes through speaker. Bridge destroyed, complete structural collapse, gap approximately 60 to 70 feet, crossing impossible for armor. Piper doesn't respond immediately. He's doing rapid mental calculation, assessing alternatives, considering options that range from limited to terrible. Bridging equipment could span 60 feet, but it would take hours to deploy. Hours he doesn't have, hours during which American reinforcements will arrive, and air support will return with the clearing weather. Detour routes exist. Maps show other crossings north and south. But detours consume fuel and time, both of which are measured in quantities he no longer possesses. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Without this bridge, the offensive timeline is broken. Everything that follows will be improvisation against a prepared enemy, desperation replacing the careful planning that got him this far. He grabs the radio handset, transmits to all units. Brücke zerstört, halt advance, await new orders. Bridge destroyed. The German words are factual, devoid of emotion, professional military communication. But every officer listening understands the implications. This isn't a temporary setback. This is the hinge moment where Operation Wacht am Rhein begins its transformation from offensive to encirclement, from breakthrough to desperate survival. Piper orders reconnaissance units to find alternate crossings, orders engineers to assess bridging possibilities, orders his column to begin the complex process of reversing direction on narrow Belgian roads in darkness while under sporadic American artillery fire. It's chaos managed through discipline, disaster mitigated through training, but mitigation isn't victory. As his forces begin the messy business of tactical reorganization, Piper stands in his half-track turret and stares west toward the invisible Meuse River that's suddenly, impossibly far away. At the American positions in Trois-Ponts, the reaction is different but equally profound. When the bridge explodes, when the shockwave rattles windows and the noise echoes off valley walls, when dust and smoke rise from the river in a mushroom cloud visible for miles, Company C engineers experience something between relief and disbelief. They did it, against an SS panzer column with minimal weapons and improvised defensive positions. They held long enough to destroy the objective. 8 men dead, 14 wounded, defensive positions shattered, ammunition nearly expended, but the bridge is gone. Lieutenant Edelstein staggers to a window, looks through the smoke toward where the bridge stood, sees the gap, sees German tanks halted on the approach road, and feels something break inside him that might be stress or fear, or the adrenaline crash that follows combat. He sits down hard, back against a wall, and for 30 seconds simply breathes while his hands shake uncontrollably. The explosion is audible 12 miles away in Stavelot, a distant rumble that Allied officers correctly interpret as demolition charges. Within minutes, reports are flowing up the chain of command. Trois-Ponts bridge destroyed. German advance halted at Amblève crossing. Northern thrust stalled. At 1st Army headquarters, staff officers mark the information on situation maps, begin to understand that the pattern of German attacks is focusing on certain routes, certain objectives, that this isn't a broad front offensive, but a narrow penetration attempt dependent on specific road networks. The intelligence assessment changes from enemy offensive of unknown scale and intent to enemy armored thrust toward Meuse River, primary routes now interdicted at Trois-Ponts, which means reinforcements can be directed, blocking positions established, the response calibrated to actual German capabilities rather than feared possibilities. The destruction of one Belgian bridge by one platoon of engineers in 90 minutes of chaotic combat has provided the intelligence clarity that allows division-level response, strategic effects from tactical actions, the definition of warfare's fundamental unpredictability. As darkness settles completely over Trois-Ponts, both sides assess damage and possibilities. German forces control the eastern approaches to the destroyed bridge. American forces hold the front, western bank, and between them is 65 feet of empty space filled with rubble and river and the corpses of men who died in the final rush. The acoustic echo of the explosion fades, replaced by the ambient sounds of war, diesel engines, distant artillery, wounded men calling for medics in German and English. Tomorrow will bring new battles, new crises, new desperate improvisations as both armies adjust to changed circumstances. But tonight, at this moment, in this obscure Belgian town that nobody planned for, history has turned on 900 pounds of TNT and one lieutenant's decision to blow the bridge with 90 seconds to spare. The acoustic boom that carried 12 miles will echo through military histories for 80 years, analyzed and studied and taught, as the moment when Hitler's last offensive lost its speed and began its inevitable collapse into defeat. December 17th, 1944, 7:15 in the evening. The explosion at the Amblève Bridge is barely 30 minutes in the past when Piper's reconnaissance teams return with information that reignites desperate hope. There's another bridge, 1 mile south, across the Somme River, a secondary crossing that intelligence maps marked but operational planning largely ignored because the primary route through Trois-Ponts was supposed to be clear and fast. But desperate circumstances transform secondary routes into primary objectives, and Piper is nothing if not adaptable. The reconnaissance report is brief. Steel truss bridge, smaller than the Amblève crossing, appears intact, minimal American presence observed. The route requires backtracking east, turning south through narrow village roads, then approaching the Somme Bridge from an angle that adds 3 kilometers and perhaps an hour to the advance. But an hour is better than never. Better than abandoning the offensive. Better than admitting that one destroyed bridge defeated the entire northern thrust of Germany's final gamble. The Somme Bridge was never intended to carry panzer columns. Built in 1928 to serve local traffic between small villages, it's a modest structure, 85 feet of steel truss spanning the Somme River at a point where the water runs shallow and fast over rocky bed. The engineering is sound but not robust, designed for farm trucks and civilian cars, not 45-ton Panthers and 50-ton King Tigers. Weight limits posted at both ends warn against heavy vehicles, though those warnings assume peacetime conditions and cooperative drivers. In war, weight limits are suggestions to be ignored when necessity demands. Piper's armor officers examine photographs from the reconnaissance, calculate load-bearing capacity based on truss design and span length, conclude that Panthers might cross if they go one at a time, and distribute weight carefully. King Tigers are questionable, too heavy, too likely to exceed structural limits and drop the bridge into the river. But some crossing capability is better than none. They'll send Panthers first, establish a bridgehead, worry about heavy armor later. By 8 o'clock, the column is repositioning, tanks backing up on narrow roads, half-tracks jockeying for turning space, the complex choreography of mechanized units changing direction in darkness and enemy territory. It's slow, inefficient, exactly the kind of delay that kills offensive momentum. Tank commanders curse the darkness, the roads, the Americans, the intelligence that said Trois-Ponts would be lightly defended. Fuel gauges continue their relentless decline, engines idling, vehicles maneuvering, time and gasoline, both finite resources being consumed without corresponding progress toward objectives. Piper monitors fuel reports with increasing alarm. Column average now at 28%, some vehicles dangerously close to 20%, margins narrowing to the point where abandoning vehicles becomes probability rather than possibility. He's fought in Russia, watched German offensives collapse when logistics failed, when tanks ran dry and became stationary targets for Soviet artillery. The pattern is repeating, the same death spiral of overextended supply lines and fuel starvation, but faster this time, compressed into hours instead of weeks. 9:30 in the evening. The German vanguard approaches the Somme Bridge from the southeast, moving cautiously now because surprise is gone, and every bridge in Belgium might be wired for demolition. The lead Panther advances with infantry screening ahead, soldiers probing darkness with flashlights and growing anxiety, expecting American fire from every shadow. The town near the bridge, a hamlet without official name, just a cluster of houses, appears deserted. Civilians fled hours ago when word spread of German approach. The bridge itself is dark. No lights visible, no obvious defensive positions. But absence of visible defense doesn't mean absence of defense. Every soldier who's survived, the Western Front knows that Americans are methodical about bridge demolitions, that combat engineers wire every crossing for destruction, that apparent abandonment might mask prepared positions waiting for targets to expose themselves. What Piper doesn't know, what his intelligence hasn't revealed, because American defensive planning was improvised in hours rather than days, is that Lieutenant Tom Stack and a reinforced squad from Company C are positioned in houses overlooking the Somme Bridge approach. Stack is 26, Iowa farm kid who learned demolitions working with his father in limestone quarries, understands explosives with the intuitive knowledge that comes from hands-on experience rather than textbook theory. When the Amblev bridge exploded, when word came that Germans were stalled but searching for alternatives, Major Yates dispatched Stack south with orders that were simple and inflexible. Defend the Somme Bridge, destroy it if German forces approach, do not allow crossing under any circumstances. Stack has 16 men, 2 bazookas, 1 Browning automatic rifle, and approximately 400 pounds of TNT wired into the steel truss supports. Insufficient for sustained defense against an armored column, barely adequate for the only mission that matters, buying time to blow the bridge. 10 o'clock. The German probe intensifies. Infantry advance to within 100 yards of the bridge, moving in short rushes, using darkness and terrain for cover. They're good. Experienced some soldiers who understand that the Americans are somewhere in those houses, who know that rushing blindly forward invites ambush, who've learned through survival that patience in night operations saves lives. Stack watches through a window, counting Germans, estimating unit strength, waiting for the moment when targets present themselves, clearly enough to justify revealing defensive positions. Beside him, Private Koenig has his hand on the bar trigger, 19 rounds in the magazine, another 6 magazines and pouches on his belt. The bar is Company C's only automatic weapon, heavier than a Thompson submachine gun, capable of sustained suppressive fire that might slow German infantry long enough for demolition. But opening fire also reveals their position, invites concentrated return fire, starts a countdown measured in minutes until Germans bring up armor and reduce these houses to rubble. The Germans make the decision for him. A Wehrmacht lieutenant, frustrated by slow progress and aware that dawn is approaching with its promise of American air superiority, orders an accelerated advance. 3 squads rush the bridge simultaneously, 40 men running in organized chaos, betting that speed and numbers will overwhelm whatever defense exists. Stack doesn't hesitate. Open fire! The bar erupts first. Koenig walking tracers across the bridge approach, red streaks in darkness marking trajectories. Rifle fire joins from multiple positions, muzzle, flashes bright enough to ruin night vision, sound enormous in the confined valley. Germans drop, some hit, others taking cover, squad cohesion fragmenting under fire. A bazooka launches from a basement window, rocket streaking toward a half-track that's advancing to support the infantry assault. The projectile impacts the vehicle's front plate, penetrates thin armor, detonates inside the crew compartment. The half-track lurches to a stop, burning, silhouetting other vehicles behind it. The German response is immediate and professional. Machine gun fire rakes American positions. MG-42s cycling at rates that make individual shots indistinguishable, just a continuous buzzsaw noise that chews through wood and plaster. Mortar rounds begin falling, 81mm high explosives that airburst over the houses. Shrapnel whining through darkness, forcing defenders to take cover or die. Tank cannons join the chorus, Panthers engaging visible muzzle flashes with high explosive, rounds that obliterate firing positions. The house where Stack is positioned takes a direct hit, the second floor collapsing into the first, roof beams falling, interior becoming a trap of debris and dust and potential burial. Stack and Koenig scramble for the exit, crawling over rubble, ears ringing from concussion, tasting blood where shrapnel nicked Stack's face. Behind them, 2 engineers don't make it out, buried in the collapse, calling for help that won't arrive in time. 11 o'clock. The defensive perimeter is collapsing under weight of German firepower. Stack's radio, a backpack SCR 300 set that's supposed to maintain contact with company headquarters, is dead, destroyed in the house collapse or damaged by shockwave, leaving him tactically isolated. He's down to 11 effectives, both bazookas expended, the Beosyar jammed from dirt contamination, ammunition running low across the board. German infantry are within 50 yards of the bridge, close enough that he can hear their voices, German commands being shouted over the chaos of combat. Time has run out. He makes the same calculation Edelstein made 4 hours ago at the Amblève. Blow it now while we can, or lose it and fail the mission and die for nothing. He crawls to where Sergeant Edwin Pig is manning the detonator, Pig having survived the Amblève fight and been immediately redeployed south because experience matters and Company C has precious little to spare. "Blow it!" Stack screams over the gunfire. Pig doesn't require repetition. He's already reaching for the plunger, already committed to the action before the order completes. His hands close on the device, muscle memory from earlier detonation making the motion automatic. And he drives the plunger down with both palms. The circuit completes, current races through wire, blasting caps initiate, and 400 pounds of TNT transforms the Somme bridge from obstacle to memory in the span of 1 second. The explosion is smaller than the Amblève detonation, less total explosive, lighter structure, but the effect is equally absolute. The steel trusses, already stressed beyond design limits by years of use and wartime neglect, shatter like brittle metal under thermal shock. The roadbed collapses immediately, 85 feet of bridge dropping into the Somme River with a splash that sends water cascading over both banks. German infantry on the approach are caught by the blast wave, 3 men killed outright, 5 wounded by flying debris. The rest fall back, stunned by the sudden destruction of their objective. 2 o'clock in the morning, December 18th. Stack's survivors are withdrawing west through darkness, moving cross-country to avoid roads, carrying wounded on improvised stretchers, navigating by compass and hope, because maps are useless in unfamiliar terrain at night. They have lost 5 men, 2 dead in the house collapse, 3 missing and presumed captured or killed during the final retreat. The survivors are exhausted beyond normal fatigue, operating on adrenaline and training and the primitive survival instinct that keeps soldiers moving, even when rest seems more important than escape. Stack himself is wounded, shrapnel in his shoulder, bleeding through field dressing, pain managed through shock, and the knowledge that stopping means capture, and capture means facing the SS after killing dozens of their comrades. They reach American lines near Trois-Ponts at 3:30, challenged by sentries who almost shoot them before recognition codes are exchanged, collapsing into positions where other Company C engineers stare at them like ghosts risen from graves. Piper receives the report at 2:15, listening via radio as his engineer officer describes the second bridge destruction, the impassable gap, the mounting casualties from these unexpected delaying actions. For the first time since the offensive began, his voice carries something approaching despair. Both bridges destroyed, both primary crossings, the engineer confirms. Both bridges gone, gaps too wide for hasty bridging, current too fast for fording operations, American forces alerted and reinforcing. The northern route to the Meuse, the route that looks so clean on maps, so achievable in planning, is now blocked at multiple points. Options are narrowing, fuel is depleting, time is passing. And somewhere to the west, American commanders are using the hours Company C bought them to position reinforcements, to establish blocking positions, to transform what should have been a breakthrough into an encirclement. Piper studies his maps by flashlight, searching for alternatives, finding only bad choices and worse choices, and the growing realization that the offensive he was supposed to lead to victory is instead leading him into a trap. The Somme Bridge demolition receives less historical attention than the Amblève, lacks the dramatic timing and strategic clarity of that first explosion, but its destruction eliminates Piper's immediate fallback option, forces him into a southern detour that adds critical hours to his timeline, consumes fuel he can't replace, and positions his Kampfgruppe on roads that lead away from the Meuse rather than toward it. Combined with the Amblève destruction, the 2 demolished bridges create a gap in German offensive capacity that Allied forces will exploit ruthlessly over the coming days. Stack's defense, like Edelstein's before him, costs American lives, 5 dead, 7 wounded, but buys time measured in hours, and hours in mobile warfare determine whether armies advance or retreat, whether offensives succeed or collapse, whether history remembers you as victor or cautionary tale. As dawn approaches on December 18th, as weather begins to clear and American aircraft prepare to return to Belgian skies, the significance of two destroyed bridges becomes apparent even to those who didn't plan for Trois-Ponts to matter. Sometimes, geography and timing and a handful of engineers with too much courage and not enough support become the hinge upon which campaigns turn. The Somme Bridge is gone, dropped into dark water, steel and concrete settling into riverbed mud, where it will rest for years before being replaced. And Joachim Peiper, master of armored warfare and believer in lost causes, turns his column south into terrain that offers no easy routes and fewer good outcomes. December 18th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. Joachim Peiper sits in his command half-track, studying maps by the dim glow of a red-lensed flashlight that preserves night vision while revealing the geometry of his disaster. The maps tell a story of routes blocked and options eliminated and time consumed without corresponding progress. Trois-Ponts blocked, Amblève Bridge destroyed, Somme Bridge destroyed. Northern routes to the Meuse, impassable without bridging equipment he doesn't have and time he can't spare. His finger traces alternative roads, searching for any route that leads west, that avoids American strongpoints, that reaches the Meuse before his fuel runs out. There's one possibility, a southern detour through L'Église and Stoumont, narrow mountain roads that wind through forested hills before rejoining the valley routes toward Werbemont. It adds 25 kilometers to an advance that's already behind schedule. It consumes fuel reserves that are measured in percentages rather than comfortable margins. But it's a route, it exists, and existence at this point is sufficient justification. The mathematics of failure are becoming unavoidable. Original plan: reach Meuse by December 18th dawn, establish bridgehead before Allied air returns. Current situation: December 18th. Dawn approaching, still 35 kilometers from Meuse, bridges behind him destroyed, routes ahead uncertain. Fuel state: column average 25%, with significant variation, some vehicles at 30%, others critically low at 15%. Time remaining before weather clears. Intelligence estimates 6 to 8 hours of continued cloud cover, maybe less if forecast models are accurate, which means 6 hours to cover 35 kilometers, establish bridgehead, secure crossing against certain American counterattack. 6 hours to accomplish what should have taken 18 under ideal conditions. The probability of success is approaching zero, but approaching zero isn't zero, and soldiers don't surrender to probability curves. They adapt. They improvise. They push forward until physics or logistics or enemy action makes further advance literally impossible. 6 o'clock. Radio conference with General Moncke at 1st SS Panzer Corps headquarters. The connection is poor, static and encryption artifacts making voices distorted. But the substance is clear enough. Moncke wants explanations. Why is Kampfgruppe Peiper stalled at Trois-Ponts? Why weren't bridge demolitions prevented? Why is the vanguard of 6th SS Panzer Army's main thrust sitting stationary while American forces reinforce? Peiper provides facts stripped of excuse, bridges destroyed before capture, American engineer resistance stronger than intelligence predicted, alternative routes being pursued. Moncke's response is what Peiper expected, a mixture of exhortation and threat, demands to resume advance immediately, warnings about consequences of failure, reminders that the Führer himself is monitoring this offensive. Peiper acknowledges, provides no promises except commitment to continue, terminates the call before Moncke can issue orders that are tactically impossible to execute. Command communications in crisis become performance art, ritualized exchanges of determination and confidence that mask underlying reality that operations are failing. 7:15. First light breaking over the Ardennes, gray dawn revealing the scope of Peiper's predicament. His column is strung out over 12 kilometers of Belgian roads, from vanguard at Trois-Ponts to rearguard still east of Stavelot. The force that looked so impressive in darkness, 100 armored vehicles, 4,000 men, the concentrated power of SS mechanized warfare, appears fragmented and vulnerable in daylight. Vehicles are bunched at crossroads where traffic congestion developed. Infantry are dispersed in defensive positions rather than concentrated for assault. Supply trucks are scattered, some still carrying ammunition and rations, others already emptied and burning after American artillery found them. The column that should be a spear driving into Allied lines looks more like a snake that swallowed something too large, stretched thin and unable to maneuver. Piper watches American reconnaissance aircraft, probably L-4 observation planes, orbiting overhead, staying out of anti-aircraft range, marking positions for artillery and inevitable airstrikes. The weather is clearing. The grace period of low clouds and poor visibility is ending. Everything that follows will happen under American air superiority. 8 o'clock. The decision crystallizes. Northern routes are blocked. Static defense is death under air attack. Retreat is unthinkable, both tactically and politically. The only option is movement, south through L'Église, west through Stoumont, then northwest toward Werbemont, and the original objective of reaching the Meuse. It's a gamble with poor odds, but war is often choice between bad options and worse options. And at least movement offers possibility of breakthrough, whereas remaining stationary guarantees destruction. Piper issues orders. Column will advance south, bypassing Trois-Ponts entirely, seeking alternative crossings of the Amblève further upstream. Rear guard will establish blocking positions to prevent American pursuit. All vehicles critically low on fuel will be abandoned. Crews will transfer to vehicles with better fuel states. Equipment will be destroyed to prevent capture, no time for towing or repairs. It's brutal triage, accepting losses to preserve combat power, the kind of decision that looks reasonable on maps and feels like abandonment to soldiers watching their vehicles being demolished. 9:30. The column begins moving south, Panthers leading, infantry and half-tracks following, the rear echelon of supply vehicles and artillery struggling to keep pace. The roads are worse than maps indicated. Narrow single-lane tracks with tight curves, grades that make heavily loaded vehicles struggle, surfaces covered in ice that treacherously conceals black ice underneath. Progress is measured in hundreds of meters per hour rather than kilometers. Tanks that should cruise at 30 kilometers per hour on decent roads manage 5 or 6 on these mountain tracks. Fuel consumption increases dramatically, engines working at maximum load to maintain traction. Gearboxes straining, tracks chewing through gasoline at rates that make Piper's logistics officers blanch when they calculate remaining range. The detour that should add 2 hours of travel time is becoming 4, 5, possibly 6 hours of slow agony through terrain that favors defenders over attackers. By 10 o'clock, reality is undeniable. The offensive has failed in its primary objective. They will not reach the Meuse on schedule. They probably won't reach the Meuse at all. The northern thrust that was supposed to split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp has stalled 35 kilometers from its intermediate objective, blocked by destroyed bridges and fuel starvation and American resistance that intelligence never predicted. What remains is survival. Getting the Kampfgruppe to defensible positions, securing fuel from any available source, holding ground until follow-on forces arrive, or until orders come to withdraw. Piper doesn't admit this aloud, doesn't communicate it to his subordinates, maintains the fiction that they're still advancing toward objectives. But his actions reveal understanding, ordering reconnaissance teams to identify fuel dumps rather than enemy positions, directing units to take defensible villages rather than bypassing resistance, conserving ammunition for defense rather than expending it in attacks. The psychological shift from offensive to defensive mindset happens gradually, without formal announcement, as officers and soldiers independently realize is that the mission parameters have changed from breakthrough to Meuse to survive until relieved. The hours between 10 and noon become a fugue of movement without progress, activity without achievement. The column advances 5 kilometers south, encounters American resistance at a crossroads, deploys for assault, discovers the Americans have withdrawn after brief contact, continues forward only to encounter another delaying position. It's textbook American defensive doctrine, mobile defense in depth, refusing to hold untenable positions, but making Germans pay in time and ammunition for every kilometer gained. And time, at this point, is more valuable than terrain. Every hour Piper spends maneuvering through these hills is an hour American commanders use to position reinforcements, to establish blocking positions astride the routes to Werbemont, to prepare the trap that's closing around him. He knows this, understands the operational dynamic, but understanding doesn't provide alternatives. He can only continue forward because stopping means accepting defeat, and accepting defeat means facing consequences that extend beyond military failure into questions of loyalty and ideology and whether he believes the final victory propaganda that Berlin still broadcasts. Noon. Weather finally, definitively clearing. Clouds breaking up, patches of blue sky visible, winter sun weak but present. And with clear skies comes the sound that German soldiers on the Western Front have learned to dread, the distant rumble of radial engines. American aircraft approaching with bombs and rockets and cannon that turn armored vehicles into burning wrecks. Piper orders maximum dispersion, vehicles pulling off roads into forest cover, crews camouflaging tanks with evergreen branches, anti-aircraft guns unlimbering in clearings where they might provide some defense against air attack. The column that was advancing becomes scattered across several square kilometers of Belgian forest, immobile and vulnerable, waiting for aircraft that everyone knows are coming. The first P-47 Thunderbolts arrive at 12:15, 4 aircraft in Finger 4 formation, orbiting over the Amblève Valley with predatory patience, searching for targets worth expending ordnance on. They spot something, probably a vehicle that moved after the dispersion order, probably a half-track whose crew panicked and tried to find better cover. The Thunderbolts roll into attack runs, diving nearly vertical, releasing high explosive bombs that tumble through the air before detonating among the trees. The sound is distinctive, different from artillery, a high explosive crump followed by silence rather than the continuous roar of barrage fire. Then, aircraft engines climbing back to altitude, circling, looking for more targets. By 1500 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Piper's Kampfgruppe has advanced 12 kilometers south from Trois-Ponts, consumed critical fuel reserves, lost 8 vehicles to air attack, and achieved no strategic objective. The decision made at dawn, the commitment to southern detour, has produced movement without breakthrough, consumption without gain. Ahead lie more narrow roads, more American defensive positions, more delays measured in hours that the offensive timeline no longer possesses. Behind him, the bridges at Trois-Ponts remain destroyed, impassable obstacles that prevent reinforcement or resupply from following his route. And to the west, invisible but inevitable, American armored, divisions are moving into blocking positions at Werbemont and beyond, prepared to meet his advance with force that outnumbers and outguns his depleted Kampfgruppe. The offensive continues in technical sense, vehicles still moving, soldiers still fighting, orders still being issued and executed. But the operational purpose has shifted from achieving objectives to surviving, from winning to not losing too catastrophically. In the cupola of his Panther, map case open to pages that show routes he'll never take and objectives he'll never reach, Joachim Piper makes peace with reality that he won't admit to subordinates or superiors. The decision made at Trois-Ponts to destroy those bridges, to force his detour, has already determined the outcome of Operation Wacht am Rhein's northern thrust. Everything that follows is epilogue to failure, written by 140 American engineers who held for 90 minutes. December 18, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, chafed to those who work there, occupies a former girls' school in Versailles, rooms that once housed teenagers now converted to war planning, with maps covering elegant wallpaper and radio equipment, replacing Louis XIV furniture. In the operations center, staff officers are collating overnight reports from the Ardennes sector, transforming fragmentary tactical information into strategic understanding. The reports paint a picture that crystallizes with each new data point: major German offensive confirmed, multiple penetration points along 80-kilometer front, American units in retreat or surrounded. But one report stands out for different reason. Kampfgruppe Piper, identified as strongest German spearhead, stopped at Trois-Ponts. Not slowed, not delayed, stopped. Bridges destroyed, northern route interdicted, offensive momentum broken. A lieutenant colonel whose name history won't remember marks this information on the situation. Map with red grease pencil, one small notation that will inform decisions affecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers. General Dwight Eisenhower arrives at 9 o'clock, having driven through night from Paris after receiving initial reports of German offensive. He's tired, visible in his face, in the tension around his eyes, but his demeanor is calm, projective of confidence that subordinates rely on during crisis. The briefing is comprehensive, German forces have achieved tactical surprise, penetrated Allied lines at multiple points, advanced 15 to 20 kilometers in first 36 hours. Losses are significant but not catastrophic. Several thousand American casualties, multiple units overrun, but no major formations destroyed. The key assessment comes from intelligence officer, who's been tracking German movements through ultra-decrypts and scout reports. Sir, the German main effort appears concentrated in the north, following route from Losheim Gap toward Liège and Antwerp. Kampfgruppe Piper, 1st SS Panzer Division, was leading this thrust, because they have been stopped at Trois-Ponts. Bridge demolition successful, German column now rerouting south, adding significant time to their advance. Eisenhower studies the map, measuring distances with his fingers, calculating what this delay means operationally. The strategic significance takes minutes to recognize, but will require hours to exploit. If Piper, the strongest, fastest, most dangerous German spearhead, is stalled at Trois-Ponts, if he is consuming time rerouting through mountain roads, then the northern penetration isn't moving at breakthrough speed, which means Allied forces have time to reposition, to deploy reserves, to establish blocking positions before German armor reaches critical objectives. It's opportunity born from crisis, the chance to transform reactive defense into prepared counterattack. But opportunity requires resources, fresh troops, mobile reserves, armored divisions not committed to other sectors. And those resources are scattered across France and Belgium, deployed according to pre-offensive dispositions that assume static defensive front. Getting them to the Ardennes, positioning them correctly, requires command decisions made under uncertainty and executed with precision. Eisenhower turns to his operations officer. What reserves do we have? What units can reach the Ardennes within 24 hours? The answer is simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging. Significant Allied reserves exist in theater, including 2 elite airborne divisions resting in France after Operation Market Garden. Terrifying. Those reserves are dispersed, many units still recovering from earlier operations, transport capacity limited by fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure. But they exist, and existence is sufficient. Eisenhower makes the call that will define Allied response to the bulge. I want 82nd and 101st Airborne, moving to the Ardennes immediately. Find trucks, find trains, commandeer civilian transport if necessary. Get them to blocking positions north and south of the German penetration. Priority goes to northern shoulder. If intelligence is right and Piper's stopped at Trois-Ponts, we can contain the breakthrough before it reaches the Meuse. Staff officers scatter to execute. Telephones connecting to Corps headquarters, to transportation commands, to supply depots that will somehow provide fuel and ammunition for unplanned redeployments. By 11 o'clock, 200 trucks are rolling toward Bastogne and Werbemont, carrying 11,000 paratroopers who thought they were done fighting for 1944. The 82nd Airborne, veterans of Normandy, Sicily, Italy, receive orders to deploy to Werbemont, the road junction that Piper was supposed to reach on December 18th, according to German planning. The fact that Allied commanders are sending paratroopers to Werbemont on December 18th before Piper arrives is testament to the hours bought by bridge demolitions at Trois-Ponts. Without those demolished bridges, without the 18-hour delay they created, Piper's vanguard reaches Werbemont first, establishes blocking positions, secures the routes toward the Meuse. With the delay, Allied forces arrive first, transform defense into ambush, turn German offensive into German encirclement. The paratroopers don't know this during the truck ride north. They only know they're being rushed to an emergency deployment, that something bad is happening in the Ardennes, that they'll probably be fighting again within hours of arrival. The intelligence picture sharpens throughout the day as more reports arrive, as tactical information aggregates into strategic understanding. Ultra-decrypts, the secret advantage of broken German codes, reveal increasing panic in German communications. References to fuel shortages, requests for bridging, equipment, orders to Piper to resume advance immediately regardless of obstacles. The decrypts are clinical, translated from German military jargon into English intelligence reports, but they reveal psychological pressure building in German command. The offensive isn't unfolding according to plan. Timetables are slipping. Critical objectives, like Trois-Ponts bridges, were supposed to fall quickly, but instead held long enough for demolition. Intelligence officers synthesize this information, conclude that German offensive power is finite, dependent on rapid advance and fuel capture, vulnerable to delays that allow Allied response. The assessment reaches Eisenhower by 1400 hours. Enemy offensive appears to be massed armored thrust with limited strategic depth. Recommend containment strategy, block northern shoulder to prevent breakthrough to Meuse, hold Bastogne to control road network, allow German forces to advance into salient where they can be contained and destroyed. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Eisenhower convenes conference with General Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, and General Courtney Hodges, commander of 1st Army. The discussion is frank, occasionally heated, focused on allocation of responsibility and resources. Bradley argues that 1st Army can contain the offensive with existing forces, plus the deploying airborne divisions. Hodges warns that German forces are stronger than initial reports suggested, that multiple American divisions are combat ineffective after being overrun, that without significant reinforcements, the northern shoulder might collapse. Eisenhower makes the decision that will prove controversial but operationally sound. Northern Allied forces, including units currently under Bradley's command, will temporarily transfer to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery will coordinate northern response, ensuring unified command and preventing German breakthrough. To Liège. Bradley is unhappy. Transferring American forces to British command is political as well as military issue, but accepts the necessity. Combat effectiveness matters more than pride. The orders go out. Montgomery takes operational control of northern shoulder, effective immediately. By 6 o'clock in the evening, reconnaissance reports confirm that lead elements of 82nd Airborne are arriving at Werbemont, occupying positions astride the roads that Piper needed to use for continued advance. The paratroopers dig in quickly, deploying anti-tank guns, establishing observation posts, preparing defensive positions with the efficiency of veterans who understand that hasty positions mean death when armor attacks. Behind them, additional forces are arriving, tank destroyer battalions, artillery batteries, engineer units to prepare demolitions on remaining bridges. The defensive architecture that will contain Piper's Kampfgruppe is taking shape, built from improvisation and urgency in the 18 hours of delay created at Trois-Ponts. Without that delay, these forces arrive too late, find Germans already established in blocking positions, face the prospect of attacking uphill against prepared defenses instead of defending against depleted attackers. The timing margins are thin. 6 hours different in Piper's arrival time might change everything. But 6 hours is what the engineers at Trois-Ponts provided, and 6 hours is sufficient. The 6th SS Panzer Army's entire offensive architecture begins collapsing under the weight of delayed timetables and fuel shortages. Kampfgruppe Piper was supposed to be vanguard for 3 follow-on battle groups, Hansen, Sandig, and Nittel, each following parallel routes toward the Meuse. But with Piper stalled and rerouting, with bridges destroyed and roads clogged, the follow-on forces can't advance on schedule. They stack up behind the stalled vanguard, consuming fuel while stationary, providing targets. For American artillery that's beginning to range the roads. Radio intercepts capture, increasing desperation in German communications. Request fuel resupply immediately. Cannot advance, route blocked. Sustaining casualties from air attack. The operational dynamic has shifted from German offensive outrunning Allied response to German forces trapped in narrowing salient, surrounded by reinforcements, running out of time and fuel and options. And the hinge point, the moment when offensive became encirclement, traces directly to 2 destroyed bridges and 140 engineers who held 90 minutes. December 19th. Eisenhower receives final confirmation that the northern shoulder is stabilizing, that Piper's Kampfgruppe is effectively contained, that German offensive has achieved tactical penetration without strategic breakthrough. The assessment includes retrospective analysis of key actions during first 48 hours of offensive. Trois-Ponts bridge demolitions receive specific mention. Defense by Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, resulted in 18-hour delay of enemy spearhead and destruction of primary route to Meuse River. This action provided time for deployment of strategic reserves and establishment of blocking positions. Assessment, tactically significant, strategically decisive. It's the kind of citation that sounds bureaucratic, clinical, stripped of human cost and individual courage. But it's also recognition that sometimes history turns on actions by junior officers and enlisted soldiers, whose names won't appear in newspaper headlines or official histories. 8 engineers dead at Trois-Ponts, 14 wounded. For what? For 18 hours, for strategic clarity, for time that allowed armies to reposition and offensives to fail, and soldiers hundreds of miles away to survive because reinforcements arrived before collapse. That's the ripple effect. That's how one destroyed bridge in Belgium changes outcomes. Across Western Europe, the stone arches drop into the Amblève River at 6:47 on December 17th, and by December 19th, entire German armies are trapped in salients they can't escape because they never crossed that river on schedule. Cause and effect, tactical action and strategic consequence, individual courage and historical outcome, all connected by demolished bridges and bought time and the mathematics of warfare that's sometimes reduced to seconds. December 20th, 1944. While headlines focus on Bastonia's encirclement and Patton's dramatic relief operation, a parallel war is being fought across the Ardennes by soldiers whose primary weapons aren't rifles but demolition charges, Bailey Bridge components, and bulldozers. Combat engineers, the unglamorous specialists who build and destroy infrastructure, who clear mines and construct fortifications, who operate at the boundary between construction and combat, are fighting their own desperate campaign across a 100-kilometer front. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion at Trois-Ponts represents just one unit among dozens engaged in similar operations, destroying bridges ahead of German advances, building new crossings for Allied counterattacks, clearing routes through minefields, all while under artillery fire and air attack and the constant pressure of deadlines measured in hours rather than days. This is warfare as applied engineering, where slide rules and demolition tables matter as much as courage and marksmanship. The pattern established at Trois-Ponts repeats itself across the northern shoulder of the bulge, with variations in outcome but consistency in method. At Habier-Mont, 6 miles west of Trois-Ponts, engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion destroy a stone bridge over the Lienne Creek just minutes before German reconnaissance units arrive. The demolition is textbook perfect. Charges placed against bridge abutments, detonation, time to drop the center span while German vehicles are in sight, but not yet in range to prevent demolition. Cost: 0. American casualties, bridge irreparably destroyed. German advance diverted south, adding 2 hours to their route. At Chenou, 2 miles north, a Bailey Bridge erected just days earlier to replace a damaged crossing is deliberately destroyed by its builders when intelligence reports German armor approaching. Engineers wire the temporary bridge, wait until last possible moment to ensure friendly forces have crossed, then blow it while German tanks are 800 yards away. The tactical calculus is brutal but necessary. Better to destroy your own infrastructure than allow enemy to use it. At Neuf-Moulins, the situation becomes complicated by civilian presence and military necessity intersecting. The village bridge is old, built in 1796, historical landmark, irreplaceable piece of local heritage. Belgian mayor pleads with American engineers to spare it, argues that alternate routes exist, that destroying this bridge will economically devastate the village for generations. Lieutenant James Gamble, company commander of the engineers tasked with demolition, understands the mayor's position but can't prioritize historical preservation over military necessity. His orders are unambiguous. All bridges demolished, no exceptions. He gives the mayor 2 hours to evacuate civilians, then places charges and destroys a bridge that stood through 2 previous wars. The explosion drops 200-year-old stonework into the river, and the mayor watches with tears running down his face. This is what winning looks like sometimes. Pragmatic destruction of things that matter because enemy advance matters more. Gamble writes in his diary that night, "We destroyed something beautiful today. We had no choice. War forgives nothing, preserves nothing, honors nothing except victory." The scope of engineer operations extends far beyond demolition. While public attention focuses on bridges destroyed, equal effort goes into bridges constructed, Temporary spans erected under fire to maintain supply lines, to enable counterattacks, to keep armies mobile. Bailey bridges, the British-designed modular bridge system adopted by American forces, become ubiquitous across the Ardennes. These prefabricated steel structures can be assembled rapidly by engineer companies, spanning gaps up to 200 feet, supporting Sherman tanks and supply trucks and the constant flow of materiel that mechanized warfare demands. Construction occurs under conditions that peacetime engineers would consider impossible. Nighttime assembly to avoid air attack, work continuing through artillery bombardment, teams replaced when casualties mount, but construction never stopping because stopped construction means static armies and static armies die. On December 22nd, elements of the 296th Engineer Combat Battalion construct a Bailey Bridge over the Arthe River near Houghton, working through the night in sub-zero temperatures while German forces shell the crossing site. The project requires 48 hours under ideal conditions. Careful assembly, precise alignment, testing before vehicles cross. They completed in 18 hours, working in shifts, replacing wounded crew members without pause, accepting casualties as inevitable cost of maintaining operational tempo. When the bridge opens to traffic at dawn, on December 23rd, 8 engineers are dead and 19 wounded. But the bridge stands, and Allied armor crosses toward German positions. And the counteroffensive that will eventually reduce the bulge becomes possible because someone built a bridge under conditions that should have made construction impossible. Minefield operations consume enormous engineer effort with minimal recognition. German forces, experienced in defensive warfare from years of Russian front retreats, mine every approach, every road, every potential crossing site with methodical precision. American engineers must clear these obstacles before infantry advances, before tanks maneuver, before supply convoys move forward. The work is terrifying, crawling through snow searching for buried explosives, probing frozen ground with bayonets, marking safe lanes with tape that might blow away in wind or be covered by snow. Mine casualties among engineer units reach 15% in some battalions, higher than infantry losses in the same period. Private Robert Dunlap, mine clearance specialist with the 39th Engineer Combat Battalion, writes to his wife, "I clear 30 mines a day. Every one might be the one that kills me. I've stopped thinking about it because thinking makes your hands shake, and shaking hands detonate mines. So I don't think. I just probe and mark and move to the next one." The engineer casualty statistics tell their own story, one largely absent from popular histories of the Battle of the Bulge. Between December 16th and January 25th, American engineer units in the Ardennes sector sustain approximately 2,400 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. This represents casualty rates comparable to frontline infantry divisions, achieved by units that military doctrine classifies as combat support rather than combat arms. The highest losses occur among bridge demolition teams and mine clearance specialists, soldiers whose work requires them to remain exposed while infantry can take cover, who must stay at objective to complete demolition even as enemy armor approaches, who have no option for tactical withdrawal because their mission is positional by definition. Company C at Trois-Ponts loses 8 killed and 14 wounded in 2 days, a 14% casualty rate for action is lasting less than 24 hours. Other engineer companies suffer similar or worse losses at Forgotten Crossroads, whose names appear in after-action reports, but never in newspapers. Recognition comes slowly and incompletely. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion receives Presidential Unit Citation for actions at Trois-Ponts, formal recognition that arrives months after the battle when survivors are scattered across Europe or already rotating home. Individual decorations include 4 Silver Stars for engineers at Trois-Ponts, 2 posthumous, and 23 Bronze Stars. Lieutenant Edelstein receives Silver Star with citation reading, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces. Despite overwhelming odds and under intense enemy fire, Lieutenant Edelstein directed the successful demolition of the Amblève River Bridge, preventing enemy armor from advancing and allowing friendly forces time to establish defensive positions." The language is formal, bureaucratic, inadequate to capture 90 minutes of terror and courage, and the split-second decision that changed strategic outcomes. Edelstein himself never speaks publicly about the action, declines interview requests from military historians, tells his family only that he did his job and that others died doing theirs. His silver star goes in a drawer. He doesn't display it. The broader pattern extends beyond individual actions to doctrinal lessons that reshape American military thinking about engineer employment. Before the Bulge, combat engineers are primarily viewed as construction specialists who occasionally fight when circumstances demand. After the Bulge, doctrine evolves to recognize engineers as combat multipliers whose defensive operations can be decisive in mobile warfare. The revised Field Manual for Engineer Operations, published in 1946, includes case studies from the Ardennes, specifically citing Trois-Ponts as example of economy of force operations, where engineer units successfully delayed superior enemy forces through planned demolitions and hasty defensive positions. Military academies teach the Trois-Ponts action in courses on defensive, operations, and combat engineering. Future officers study Edelstein's decisions, debate alternative approaches, calculate charge weights and detonation timing in practical exercises designed to replicate the circumstances engineers faced in December 44. But the human cost remains largely invisible to those who study tactics and engineering specifications. 8 engineers dead at Trois-Ponts, their names recorded in battalion casualty lists, but rarely mentioned in broader histories. Frank Rea, killed by Panther main gunfire in the house collapse. Edwin Pigg survived Trois-Ponts but died 3 weeks later clearing mines near Malmedy. Vincent Consiglio, who pushed the plunger that destroyed the Amblève Bridge, survived the war but suffered psychological trauma that contemporary military medicine didn't recognize or treat. What later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting as nightmares and hypervigilance and inability to tolerate loud noises. He worked as mechanic after the war. Never spoke about Trois-Ponts, died in 1973 with silver star in drawer and memories he couldn't escape even 30 years after the explosions stopped echoing. December 31st, 1944. 2 weeks after the Trois-Ponts action, Company C occupies positions near the original town, tasked with rebuilding the bridge they destroyed. The irony isn't lost on surviving engineers. They spent 90 minutes trying to destroy this crossing perfectly. Now, they'll spend 2 weeks trying to rebuild it adequately. The work is cold, miserable, technically challenging because the original demolition was so successful that significant structural damage must be repaired before new spans can be erected. They salvage steel from abandoned German vehicles, use captured engineering equipment, work through New Year's Eve while other units celebrate survival. Lieutenant Edelstein supervises the reconstruction with the same meticulous attention he applied to demolition, checking calculations, verifying structural integrity, ensuring the bridge will support the tanks and trucks and artillery that Allied forces need to continue offensive operations. When the bridge reopens to traffic on January 9, 1945, civilians thank the Americans for rebuilding. Nobody mentions that Americans also destroyed it. That's the engineers' war. Building and destroying and building again. Whatever the mission requires, whatever keeps armies moving and enemies stopped. The mathematics of force and structure apply equally to construction and demolition. The courage required is identical whether placing charges or driving rivets, and the engineers who do both, who fight with slide rules and explosives and rifles when circumstances demand, remain the invisible soldiers whose contributions determine outcomes, but whose names history mostly forgets. December 21st, 1944. The village of L'Église sits in the Amblève River Valley, stone houses clustered around a medieval church, population maybe 600 before the war came through. Now it's a fortress by accident, occupied by what remains of Kampfgruppe Piper, approximately 800 combat effectives, down from 4,000 who jumped off 5 days ago. They're surrounded. Not encircled in the textbook sense with continuous perimeter, but isolated within a pocket roughly 3 kilometers across, Allied forces controlling all routes in and out, artillery ranging the village from multiple directions, air superiority so absolute that daytime movement means death. Piper has consolidated his forces here not through deliberate planning, but through desperation. This is where the fuel ran out, where American blocking positions became impassable, where the offensive that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 50 hours ground a final halt 90 hours after start, and 40 kilometers short of objective. La Glaise isn't where Germany wanted to fight, it's where Germany has to die. The fuel situation crossed from critical to catastrophic on December 20th. Piper's column, already running on captured American gasoline and fumes, encountered American positions at Stoumont, 3 kilometers west of La Glaise, held by elements of 30th Infantry Division and 82nd Airborne. The Americans weren't retreating. They weren't disorganized. They were dug in with anti-tank guns and artillery support and the confidence of soldiers who know reinforcements are coming while enemy forces are isolated. Piper's assault on Stoumont consumed his remaining offensive capability. Ammunition expended, vehicles damaged, men killed or wounded, for minimal gain. A few hundred meters of advance, one burned-out American roadblock eliminated. Strategic irrelevance purchased with tactical losses he couldn't afford. By nightfall on the 20th, his fuel gauges read 5 to 10% across the surviving vehicles. Maybe enough for 10 kilometers of movement, not enough to break through American lines, not enough to retreat to German positions, barely enough to consolidate in La Glaise and prepare for siege. The vehicle inventory on December 21st tells the story of offensive collapse in mechanical terms. Piper began Operation Wacht am Rhein with approximately 100 tanks and armored vehicles. King Tigers, Panthers, Mark IVs, half-tracks, armored cars, self-propelled guns. At La Glaise, he has 39 tanks still mechanically operational, though operational is a generous term for vehicles with empty fuel tanks and critically low ammunition. 70 more vehicles are scattered along the 60 kilometers between here and the German start lines, abandoned where they ran dry, destroyed by crews to prevent capture, or knocked out by American fire. The Panthers and King Tigers sitting in La Glaise represent concentrated armor that could, in theory, smash through American positions if they had fuel and ammunition and reinforcement. In reality, they're stationary pillboxes, turrets that traverse on manual cranks because electrical systems are powered down to conserve battery. Main guns with maybe 5 rounds each, machine guns rationed to short bursts. Piper's mechanized Kampfgruppe has become static defense force, all mobility lost, reduced to holding village and waiting for outcome determined by factors beyond his control. December 22nd. The weather finally clears completely, high-pressure system bringing blue skies and winter sun, and perfect visibility for American fighter bombers that have been grounded since the offensive began. The first P-47s arrive at 0900, 4 aircraft orbiting over La Glaise at 3,000 meters, spotting targets, coordinating with ground controllers. The attack runs begin minutes later, aircraft diving nearly vertical, releasing bombs and rockets, climbing back to altitude while German anti-aircraft fire arcs behind them. The sound is continuous terror for soldiers sheltering in La Glaise, whistling bombs, explosions that shake stone buildings, secondary detonations when ammunition vehicles are hit. The effect is methodical destruction of anything that moves or looks important. Tanks in open positions, half-tracks parked near houses, supply trucks gathered at crossroads. German anti-aircraft guns shoot down one P-47. The pilot bails out, parachutes into American lines, survives, but can't prevent the systematic reduction of Piper's remaining mobile assets. By afternoon, 8 more vehicles are destroyed or damaged beyond repair, ammunition stocks are burning, and the Kampfgruppe that was supposed to reach the Meuse is being dismantled from the air. The encirclement tightens through combined action by multiple American units converging on La Glaise. To the north, 82nd Airborne holds positions at Trois-Ponts and Vermont, blocking any attempt to break out. Westward, to the south, 3rd Armored Division deploys along the Amblève Valley, cutting retreat routes toward German lines. To the east, 30th Infantry Division maintains pressure from Stoumont, preventing expansion of the pocket. It's not continuous front line, but series of blocking positions at key terrain, roads, and bridges, essentially using terrain and firepower to create perimeter that doesn't require continuous troop presence. The strategy conserves American forces while maximizing pressure on surrounded Germans, allows for concentration of artillery and air support, creates conditions where Piper must either surrender or attempt breakout that will cost most of his remaining men. Allied commanders understand the mathematics. Piper is out of fuel, low on ammunition, isolated from resupply, outnumbered approximately 15-1. Time favors the besiegers. Patience is a weapon. Inside L'Église, the psychological pressure compounds physical deprivation. Food is limited. Soldiers on half rations, sharing what little remains in captured American supplies and German field kitchens. Water is problematic. Wells exist, but drawing water in daylight invites sniper fire. Medical supplies are critically short. Morphine exhausted, bandages reused, surgery performed without anesthesia when absolutely necessary. The church basement serves as aid station. 30 wounded men lying on stone floor, while 2 doctors and 4 medics work with whatever materials they can scavenge. Piper visits daily, speaks with wounded soldiers, maintains pretense that relief is coming, that follow-on forces are breaking through American lines, that they just need to hold a little longer. The soldiers don't believe him, can see in his eyes that he doesn't believe it either, but the ritual matters because leadership in crisis is partially performance art, projecting confidence even when confidence is irrational. December 23rd. Piper holds council of war with surviving officers, discussing options that range from bad to catastrophic. Option 1, hold L'Église, wait for relief from 6th SS Panzer Army. Probability of success, minimal. Intelligence intercepts suggest that other German spearheads have also stalled, that no relief force is coming, that holding L'Église simply means dying slower. Option 2, attempt mechanized breakout, using remaining fuel to smash through American lines in coordinated assault. Probability of success, near 0. They lack fuel for sustained movement, lack ammunition for extended combat, face prepared American positions with armor and artillery support. Breakout in vehicles is suicide. Option 3, abandon all vehicles and equipment, attempt infantry escape through American lines at night, moving on foot through forest and rough terrain toward German positions 40 kilometers east. Probability of success, uncertain but higher than alternatives. Some men will certainly die, combat casualties, exposure, capture, but some might survive, and survival is mission objective now. Preservation of trained soldiers who could fight again if they reach friendly lines. The decision is option 3, made official on December 23rd afternoon. Piper issues orders to all units. Prepare to abandon vehicles and escape on foot. Destroy all equipment that can't be carried. Tank guns spiked, radios smashed, vehicles burned after fuel is drained for demolition charges. Prisoners, approximately 150 Americans captured during the advance, will be released and left at L'Église aid station when Germans depart. The decision to release prisoners is pragmatic rather than humanitarian. Can't take them on forced march through enemy territory. Can't guard them while attempting escape. Can't execute them without creating war crimes evidence. Better to leave them for American forces who'll recapture L'Église within hours of German departure. Some officers argue for executing prisoners as security measure, citing Malmedy massacre as precedent. Piper refuses. "We're not murderers," he says, ignoring the irony that this statement comes from commander whose troops massacred 84 Americans 6 days earlier. War crimes are contextual, apparently. Acceptable when advancing, war crimes when surrounded. 2 o'clock in the morning, December 24th. Christmas Eve. The evacuation begins in darkness and silence. 800 German soldiers filing out of L'Église in single column, moving east through forest trails, navigating by compass and hope. They leave behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks and armored vehicles, 25 artillery pieces, hundreds of small arms, ammunition, equipment. The material residue of failed offensive scattered across Belgian village. American guards watching L'Église from surrounding positions notice movement, report to command, but don't interfere. Better to let surrounded enemy escape as disorganized infantry than force them to defensive stand that costs American casualties. The German column moves through American positions, sometimes passing within hundreds of meters of American foxholes, sometimes detected but not engaged, sometimes simply lucky that sentries are looking the wrong direction when they pass. It's not that American security is poor, it's that forest terrain and darkness and the sheer improbability of infantry breakout create gaps that disciplined soldiers can exploit. Dawn on December 24th reveals L'Église empty of German forces and full of abandoned equipment. American infantry enter cautiously, expecting ambush or booby traps, finding instead released American prisoners and Belgian civilians emerging from cellars. The prisoner reports are consistent. Germans released them during night. Piper personally ordered them left unharmed. German column departed heading east. American officers assessed the haul, tanks and vehicles in various states of damage, but mostly intact. Fuel, tanks empty, ammunition expended, equipment that will be photographed and cataloged and displayed for propaganda purposes. The capture of Piper's entire mechanized force, without having to fight for it, without sustaining casualties taking L'Église, represents intelligence coup and morale boost. But the soldiers who fought at Trois-Ponts, who bought the time and created the delay that led to this encirclement, don't get to see the ultimate result of their actions. They're already deployed elsewhere, rebuilding bridges or clearing mines or fighting the next crisis. They'll learn eventually, from newspapers, from after-action reports, from rumors, that the SS column they stopped reached 40 kilometers further before running out of fuel and options. Whether that knowledge provides comfort or closure is question without universal answer. Piper's column, now 770 effectives, 30 dead or 2 wounded to march, reaches German lines on December 25th, after 36 hours of forest movement, wading through freezing streams, bypassing American positions, abandoning wounded who can't continue. They arrive exhausted, frostbitten, defeated. The men who were supposed to reach the Meuse and win the war return on foot, without equipment, having achieved tactical penetration and strategic failure. Piper reports to 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters, provides account of operation that emphasizes American numerical superiority and unexpected resistance at Trois-Ponts. His report doesn't mention massacre at Malmedy, doesn't explain why his column reached L'Église instead of Meuse, doesn't acknowledge that fuel planning was inadequate or that intelligence underestimated American engineering capability. Reports written by failed commanders rarely admit failure. They explain how circumstances conspired against success that was otherwise inevitable. But the facts speak regardless of narrative framing. 4,000 men jumped off, 170 returned, 100 vehicles deployed, 0 returned, 60 kilometers advanced, 40 short of objective. The mathematics of failure don't require interpretation. The trap that closed at L'Église started opening at Trois-Ponts when bridges exploded and offensive timelines broke, and desperate improvisation replaced careful planning. The engineers who detonated those charges never knew they were setting a trap. They were just trying to survive long enough to blow the bridges. But survival and tactical success combined to create strategic consequence that destroyed the strongest German offensive in the West. Sometimes, that's how wars are won, through accumulation of small actions whose ripple effects compound into decisive outcomes. The trap closes when soldiers realize they're trapped. But the trap begins when bridges fall and timelines fail, and somebody 90 kilometers away makes decision to push a detonator plunger 90 seconds before it's too late. December 25th, 1944. Christmas morning in Trois-Ponts arrives cold and clear, winter sun reflecting off snow that covers destroyed buildings and frozen river and the crater where the Amblève Bridge stood 8 days ago. Company C engineers are returning to the town they defended and destroyed, marching west from positions near Werbemont, where they've spent the last week guarding against German breakthrough that never came. They're exhausted, physical fatigue from constant movement and combat, psychological exhaustion from stress and casualties and the knowledge that friends died here. Some are wounded, but still present, wrapped in bandages and refusing evacuation because replacements are scarce, and unit cohesion matters more than individual comfort. They expected to find ruins. What they find is worse. A ghost town where memories and corpses coexist with rubble and silence. The destruction is comprehensive in ways that surprise even the soldiers who witnessed the combat. Artillery and tank fire destroyed approximately 89 buildings, 60% of the town's pre-war structures. Some are completely leveled, just foundations and scattered stone marking where houses stood. Others are partial ruins, walls standing but roofs collapsed, interiors gutted by fire. The church where civilians sheltered during fighting has taken multiple direct hits, stained glass windows shattered, roof partially collapsed, pews burned. Walking through town is walking through cemetery where architecture dies instead of people. Lieutenant Edelstein pauses at the house where he positioned the detonator, where Corporal Consiglio pushed the plunger that destroyed the bridge. The building is half collapsed, second floor sagging into first, interior exposed to winter weather. He tries to remember what he felt in that moment 8 days ago. Terror, determination, the clarity that comes from knowing the decision is binary. Blow the bridge or fail the mission. He can't recapture those emotions. They've been replaced by numbness and survivor's guilt and the lingering question of whether different tactics could have saved the men who died. Belgian civilians are emerging from shelters and cellars and the surrounding forest where they fled when fighting began. They return to find homes destroyed, possessions lost, infrastructure wrecked. The emotional response ranges from stoic acceptance to inconsolable grief, often within same families. An elderly woman stands outside her collapsed house, holding a framed photograph salvaged from rubble, crying silently. A farmer examines his barn, walls standing but roof gone, livestock dead from exposure or artillery fragments, and just shakes his head with expression beyond words. Children are oddly resilient, exploring ruins with curiosity more than trauma, treating destroyed town as adventure landscape rather than catastrophe site. But adults understand the implications. Rebuilding will take years, economic recovery longer, and the Americans who liberated them in September also destroyed much of what remained when Germans tried to recapture in December. Liberation and destruction aren't opposites sometimes. They're the same thing from different angles. Mayor Claude Marley organizes burial details for civilian casualties. 14 dead, ranging from infant killed when house collapsed during bombardment to 80-year-old man who refused to evacuate and died in his bed when artillery shell penetrated wall. The American Army provides assistance, engineer detachment to clear rubble, medical personnel to treat civilian wounded, rations to supplement depleted food supplies. Marlett accepts with gratitude mixed with resentment. The Americans didn't start this fight, didn't choose Trois-Ponts as battlefield, defended against German offensive that would have been worse if successful. But try explaining geopolitics to a woman whose husband died when American demolitions brought down her house, who understands intellectually that bridge had to be destroyed but emotionally can't forgive the soldiers who pushed the detonator. War distributes suffering without regard to justice or fairness or who deserves what. Civilians pay costs they didn't incur, bear consequences of decisions made by distant commanders, suffer because geography placed them on route that armies needed to traverse. December 26th. American intelligence officers arrived to catalog captured German equipment and interview civilian witnesses about the battle. The intelligence haul from L'Église is being documented. 132 German vehicles abandoned or destroyed between Trois-Ponts and L'Église, including examples of King Tiger tanks that Allied intelligence had limited information about. Officers photograph the vehicles, measure armor thickness, examine internal systems, document everything that might inform future anti-tank tactics or armor development. The intelligence value is significant. King Tigers are relatively rare. Encountering multiple examples in captured condition provides unique opportunity to understand German heavy tank design. But the process feels grotesque to soldiers watching. Officers walking among wrecked vehicles with notebooks and cameras, while Belgian civilians are burying their dead 50 meters away. Priorities of intelligence gathering versus humanitarian assistance don't always align. The most significant intelligence discovery comes from captured German documents, operational orders and maps taken from abandoned command vehicles in L'Église. The orders detail German planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein with specificity that confirms Allied suspicions and reveals unexpected elements. One map, marked with phase lines indicating expected progress by day, shows Trois-Ponts circled and labeled Phase Line 2 D+1, meaning Piper was supposed to control Trois-Ponts bridges by end of first day. The actual timeline, he arrived late on first day, bridges destroyed before he could cross, entire schedule disrupted. Comparing planned timeline to actual outcome reveals exactly how much Company C's defense mattered. 18 hours of delay at Trois-Ponts cascaded into complete operational failure. Intelligence analysts will study these documents for months, constructing after-action reports that assess German planning versus execution, identifying decision points where outcomes might have differed, teaching lessons that future officers will study in military academies. But in December 44, the immediate value is confirmation that the defensive actions worked, that the sacrifices achieved their purpose. December 30th. Final casualty accounting for Company C provides numbers that are simultaneously manageable and devastating. 22 engineers killed in action between December 17th and 24th, 8 at Trois-Ponts, 5 at Somme Bridge, 9 in subsequent defensive operations, near Werbemont, 38 wounded, 15 seriously enough to require evacuation and months of recovery. Out of original strength of 140 soldiers, Company C sustained 42% casualty rate in 1 week of operations. For comparison, infantry divisions typically become combat ineffective at 25% casualties, requiring withdrawal and reconstitution. Engineer units lack the replacement pipeline and organizational structure to maintain effectiveness after such losses, but they're expected to continue operating because bridges still need building, and roads still need clearing, and mines still need sweeping, regardless of whether the soldiers doing that work are fresh or exhausted or traumatized. The medals and citations arrive piecemeal over following months. Presidential Unit Citation for the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, awarded March 1945, recognizes extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy at Trois-Ponts, 4 silver stars, 2 posthumous, for actions during bridge defense, 23 bronze stars, 47 purple hearts. The decorations are displayed at battalion formation, pinned to dress uniforms, formally entered in service records. Some soldiers wear them proudly, validation that someone recognized what they endured. Others put them in footlockers and never mention them, uncomfortable with being decorated for surviving when friends died. Aware that medals don't bring back the dead or rebuild destroyed towns or explain to civilian families why their houses were demolished. Lieutenant Edelstein receives his Silver Star from Major Yates in ceremony, attended by 30 soldiers, all that remain of Company C's original roster who aren't dead or evacuated or transferred. He salutes, shakes hands, says nothing. What is there to say? 8 men died following his orders. 14 were wounded. The bridge was destroyed. The mission succeeded. History will judge whether the exchange was acceptable. January 3rd, 1945. Company C receives new orders. Rebuild the Amblève Bridge at Trois-Ponts. The mission is both practical necessity. Allied counteroffensive requires crossing sites, infrastructure must be restored, and symbolic gesture, having the same unit that destroyed the bridge rebuild it. The engineering challenge is significant. The original demolition was so successful that substantial foundation work is required before new spans can be erected. They'll use Bailey Bridge components, modular steel sections that can be assembled on site, supported by temporary pilings driven into the riverbed. The project timeline is 2 weeks. They completed in 9 days, working through sub-zero temperatures and occasional German artillery fire, driven by combination of professional pride and desire to leave something constructive behind rather than just destruction. When the bridge opens to traffic on January 12th, Belgian mayor attends. The ceremony shakes hands with American engineers, thanks them for rebuilding what they destroyed. The irony isn't mentioned because everyone understands the necessity. You destroy in war to prevent worse outcomes. You rebuild after to demonstrate that destruction wasn't the goal, just the method. The psychological cost, what later generations would term post-traumatic stress, manifests gradually rather than immediately. Soldiers don't break during combat because adrenaline and necessity suppress processing. They break afterward when the danger passes and the mind finally has space to confront what was experienced. Corporal Consiglio, who detonated the Amblève Bridge, begins having nightmares in January. Repeated dreams of pushing the plunger, watching the explosion, seeing German soldiers die, waking up sweating and disoriented. Private Rhea survived the house collapse that killed 2 friends, develops hypervigilance, startling at loud noises, unable to relax, constantly scanning for threats that no longer exist. These symptoms aren't recognized as psychological injuries by military medicine in 1944. There's no treatment, no diagnosis, no framework for understanding combat stress beyond crude distinctions between shell shock and malingering. Soldiers cope through self-medication with alcohol, through repression and denial, through dark humor that lets them discuss trauma without acknowledging it as such. Some recover naturally over months and years. Others carry invisible wounds for rest of their lives, functional but damaged. Survivors who paid psychological price that victory doesn't refund. The reckoning at Trois-Ponts is incomplete because war is still continuing. Germans are still fighting. The final victory is still months away. But already the outlines are visible. A town destroyed to save it. Soldiers dead who won't see peace. Civilians bearing costs they didn't choose, and the slow recognition that tactical success often looks like tragedy when you're standing in the rubble, counting casualties and explaining to families why their loved ones died, defending a bridge that will be rebuilt anyway. The mathematics of war reduce complex human experiences to numbers: 22 dead, 38 wounded, 89 buildings destroyed. But numbers don't capture what it felt like to make those decisions, to execute those orders, to survive when others didn't. History records that Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, successfully defended and destroyed bridges at Trois-Ponts on December 17, 1944. History doesn't record the nightmares, the guilt, the psychological fractures that soldiers carried home when the war ended. Those remain private reckonings, individual accounts that never balance. You can't calculate acceptable loss when every casualty is someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. You can only fight until it's over, count the survivors, bury the dead, and hope that future historians will at least remember their names. January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge is officially over, declared concluded by Allied command after 6 weeks of brutal winter combat across the Ardennes. The salient that German forces drove into Allied lines, the bulge that gives the battle its name, has been reduced, compressed, eliminated through coordinated counteroffensives from north and south. American and British forces have retaken all ground lost in December, pushed German units back across the border, and restored the front line to approximately where it stood before Operation Wacht am Rhein began. The statistics are staggering in their scale. American casualties exceed 80,000 men, 19,000 killed in action. German casualties approach 100,000, with additional losses in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and irreplaceable fuel stocks consumed in offensive that achieved nothing strategically. It's the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fight in the European theater, eclipsing even Normandy in casualty counts and strategic significance. And yet, within this massive operation spanning 80 kilometers and involving 500,000 soldiers, the action at Trois-Ponts remains a footnote that military historians will eventually recognize as decisive hinge point. The German offensive failed for multiple reasons, no single cause sufficient to explain collapse of operation that Hitler personally planned and staked Germany's remaining military capability upon. Fuel shortages crippled mechanized advance. Piper's Kampfgruppe ran dry. Other spearheads faced similar constraints. The Wehrmacht's dependence on captured American supplies proved fatal when those supplies weren't captured quickly enough. Allied air superiority, once weather cleared on December the 23rd, systematically destroyed German vehicles, supply columns, and bridge crossings, making daylight movement suicidal. American defensive resilience surprised German planners who assumed the Ardennes was held by green or exhausted divisions that would collapse under concentrated assault. Instead, units like 101st Airborne at Bastogne held despite encirclement, buying time for counteroffensive. And strategic reserves, particularly 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions, deployed faster than German intelligence predicted, establishing blocking positions before breakthrough could be exploited. But underlying all these factors was the 18-hour delay at Trois-Ponts, the failure to maintain offensive timeline, the disruption of carefully synchronized operation that required all elements to execute on schedule. Military analysts studying the battle create timeline comparisons, planned versus actual progress for each German Kampfgruppe. The pattern is consistent. Every unit fell behind schedule, but Piper's delay was earliest and most significant. He was supposed to reach Werbomont by December 18th dawn, crossing the Amblève at Trois-Ponts on December 17th evening, according to plan. He actually reached Le Glaise, 15 kilometers short of Werbomont, on December 20th, a 48-hour delay from planned timeline. That delay cascades through the entire offensive architecture. Follow-on forces can't advance through blocked routes. logistics can't supply spearheads that haven't reached planned positions. The synchronized multi-axis attack becomes series of isolated penetrations that Allied forces contain separately. The Trois-Ponts bridge demolitions didn't single-handedly defeat Operation Walk am Rhein, but they initiated the delay cascade that made defeat inevitable. The strategic implications extend beyond the immediate battle. Hitler's Ardennes Offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves: armor, fuel, aircraft, trained personnel, in gamble for decisive victory that would split Allied coalition. The failure means those reserves are gone, expended without achieving strategic objectives, leaving German forces critically weakened for defending against inevitable Allied offensives toward the Rhine and into Germany proper. The Eastern Front, already collapsing under Soviet pressure, receives no relief because reserves went west instead of east. By late January 1945, Red Army is advancing toward Berlin, while Western Allies prepare Rhine crossings, and Germany lacks mobile reserves to counter either threat. The Ardennes Offensive, rather than buying time through negotiated settlement or Allied disruption, actually accelerates German defeat by consuming irreplaceable military assets in failed operation. This is what Hitler gambled and lost. Not just the Bulge battle, but Germany's ability to continue meaningful resistance. The counterfactual analysis, what if Piper had crossed at Trois-Ponts on schedule, occupies military historians for decades after the war. The scenarios vary in detail but share common assessment. If Northern thrust reaches the Meuse on December 18th, Allied strategic situation becomes critically dangerous. 21st Army Group faces potential encirclement, Liège supply depots fall into German hands, Montgomery's forces might require evacuation Dunkirk style. Even if ultimate German defeat remains inevitable, and most analysts conclude it does, given Allied industrial and manpower superiority, the timeline extends significantly. 6 weeks becomes 6 months, spring 1945. Rhine crossing becomes summer or fall operation. Soviet forces reach Berlin first, establish control over more German territory, potentially occupy more of Eastern Europe before Western Allies arrive. The post-war settlement shifts, Cold War boundaries change, European political landscape looks different. These are speculative scenarios, alternative histories that can't be proven. But they illustrate that Trois-Ponts mattered beyond immediate tactical effects, that 18 hours of delay influenced strategic outcomes that shaped post-war world. The Allied command assessment, documented in after-action reports and strategic analyses produced through 1945, explicitly recognizes the northern shoulder defense as critical to containing the German offensive. General Eisenhower's final report on European operations, published in 1946, states, "The stubborn defense of key positions along the northern shoulder, particularly the actions by engineer units at river crossings in the Trois-Ponts sector, prevented enemy exploitation of initial breakthrough and provided time for deployment of strategic reserves." Its bureaucratic language, sanitized of blood and terror and individual sacrifice, but it's also official recognition that engineer actions at obscure Belgian crossroads influenced campaign outcomes. The report continues, had enemy forces achieved planned objectives along northern axis, Allied dispositions would have required significant adjustment, potentially compromising operational timeline for Rhine crossing operations. Translation: if Piper had broken through, the war might have lasted longer and cost more lives before inevitable victory. The broader Bulge statistics reveal that engineer units sustained disproportionate casualties relative to their percentage of deployed forces. Engineers represented approximately 8% of American personnel in the Ardennes sector, but suffered 12% of casualties. Higher rate than infantry in some divisions, reflecting the exposed nature of bridge demolitions, mine clearing, and defensive positions that couldn't withdraw because mission required remaining at objective, regardless of tactical situation. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion's casualties at Trois-Ponts, 42% in 1 week, weren't unique. Other engineer battalions suffered similar or worse. 291st Engineers lost 38% casualties defending crossings near Malmedy. 14th Tank Battalion, whose attached engineers fought at multiple bridge sites, reported 45% casualties, including all company commanders killed or wounded. The pattern is consistent. Engineers fought harder, held longer, died more frequently than doctrine anticipated, because defensive operations in mobile warfare required them to stand and fight where infantry could retreat and reposition. The German perspective, documented through post-war interrogations and captured documents, consistently identifies fuel shortages and bridge demolitions as critical failures. Joachim Peiper's interrogation by American intelligence officers in April 1945 includes extensive discussion of Trois-Ponts action. Asked why he couldn't capture bridges intact, Peiper responds, "American engineer discipline was unexpected. We anticipated that isolated units would retreat rather than sacrifice themselves defending untenable positions. The engineers at Trois-Ponts fought like frontline infantry, held long enough for demolition, displayed determination inconsistent with their classification as support troops." The statement is simultaneously compliment and criticism, recognition that American engineers performed beyond German expectations, and implicit accusation that their resistance was somehow unfair, that support troops weren't supposed to fight that hard. Other German officers expressed similar sentiments in interrogations, revealing assumption that American forces would behave according to German understanding of proper military hierarchy, where support units defer to combat units and casualties are suffered by appropriate personnel, rather than distributed across all branches. The fuel dependency becomes clearer through analysis of German planning documents. Operation Wacht am Rhein was predicated on capturing approximately 2 million gallons of American fuel during first 48 hours of offensive. Specific depots at Bullingen, Stavelot, Spa, identified as objectives whose capture was essential for operation continuation. Actual fuel captured, approximately 200,000 gallons, 10% of requirement, largely because American forces destroyed or evacuated fuel stocks when German breakthrough became apparent. The 10-to-1 shortfall meant that even if bridge demolitions hadn't occurred, even if Peiper crossed the Amblève on schedule, his Kampfgruppe would have run dry somewhere between Trois-Ponts and the Meuse. The mathematics were impossible from the start, but the bridge demolitions accelerated the timeline of fuel exhaustion, transformed gradual degradation of offensive capability into sudden operational paralysis. Peiper might have reached the Meuse running on fumes, might have established tenuous bridgehead before tanks went dry. Instead, he reached L'Église, 15 kilometers short, and stopped completely. That 15-kilometer difference, the distance he couldn't cover because Trois-Ponts bridges were destroyed, represents the tactical margin between dangerous German penetration and encircled German defeat. By spring 1945, as Allied forces advance across Germany and victory becomes imminent, the Ardennes battle recedes into historical memory, being actively shaped by participants and observers. Bastogne becomes the symbol of American resistance. 101st Airborne's surrounded defense capturing public imagination and newspaper headlines. Patton's Third Army Relief Operation becomes heroic narrative of dramatic rescue. The broader Bulge becomes story of American resilience in face of surprise attack, eventual triumph over desperate German gamble. These narratives aren't false. Bastogne was militarily significant. Patton's counteroffensive was operationally important. American forces did demonstrate resilience, but the narratives are incomplete, emphasizing dramatic events over quiet competence, breakthrough moments over sustained resistance, division-level operations over company-level actions. Trois-Ponts doesn't fit the heroic narrative structure. Its defensive success achieved through withdrawal and demolition rather than holding ground and defeating enemy through firepower. Its engineer unit rather than infantry or armor. Support troops rather than combat arms. Successful execution of unglamorous mission rather than dramatic last stand. So, it gets mentioned in after-action reports, recognized in unit citations, and gradually forgotten in popular histories that prefer their heroes more conventionally heroic. But the strategic analysts understand, even if popular memory doesn't preserve the details. The Bulge was decided by logistics as much as combat, by engineer actions as much as infantry heroism, by 18 hours of delay at obscure Belgian crossroads as much as by week-long siege at Bastogne. The confluence of factors, German fuel shortage, Allied air superiority, rapid reserve deployment, stubborn defensive stands, combined to transform Hitler's last offensive into Germany's last significant defeat before final collapse. And at the beginning of that confluence, at the first critical failure point where German timeline broke irreparably, was a stone bridge across the Amblève River, 900 pounds of TNT, and 140 engineers who bought 18 hours with 8 lives, and thereby influenced the timeline of German defeat. Context matters in warfare. Individual actions accumulate into operational effects that cascade into strategic outcomes. The math is complex, causation is multifactorial, but the pattern is clear. Trois-Ponts mattered. Company C mattered. The decision to push a detonator plunger 90 seconds before German infantry reached the bridge mattered. And history eventually remembers, not in popular memory maybe, not in movies and monuments, but in the careful analyses that military professionals study when they try to understand how wars are actually won through accumulation of correct tactical decisions under pressure. That's the context. That's the bulge viewed from perspective that sees past dramatic moments to structural factors, past individual heroism to systemic effects, past what feels important to what actually determined outcomes. The bridge at Trois-Ponts fell into the river on December 17th. Germany's last offensive fell apart over following weeks. The connection between those events isn't coincidence. It's cause and effect, tactical action and strategic consequence. History turning on split-second decisions made by junior officers who never imagined that blowing up one bridge would matter beyond immediate survival. May 16, 1946. The former concentration camp at Dachau has been converted to military courtroom. A deliberate choice by American prosecutors who want defendants to face justice in place that embodies Nazi crimes in the Docksid. 73 German soldiers, primarily members of 1st SS Panzer Division, charged with war crimes committed during the Battle of the Bulge. The most prominent defendant is Joachim Peiper, no longer wearing SS uniform, but dressed in simple gray suit that makes him look younger than his 31 years. The charges are specific: murder of approximately 350 American prisoners of war and 100 Belgian civilians during December 1944, advanced through the Ardennes. The evidence is overwhelming: survivor testimony, forensic analysis of massacre sites, captured German documents, Peiper's own statements during interrogation that he controlled the Kampfgruppe whose subordinates committed these atrocities. The trial will last 5 months, generate thousands of pages of testimony, and ultimately reveal uncomfortable truths about command responsibility, war crimes, prosecution, and how justice functions when applied to defeated enemies. The Malmedy massacre dominates the prosecution case, as it dominated media coverage during and after the battle. 84 American prisoners executed in a field at Baunez Crossroads on December 17th, the largest single atrocity committed against American forces by German troops in Western Europe. Survivors testify in clinical detail: the initial capture, the false security of believing they'd be peas, the moment when machine guns opened fire, the terror of playing dead while Germans walked among bodies shooting survivors. The testimony is devastating, witnesses describing watching friends die, feeling blood from corpses above them, waiting hours before escaping while bodies froze around them. Peiper's defense argues that he didn't personally order the massacre, that subordinates acted without authorization. That chaos of combat sometimes produces unauthorized actions by soldiers beyond command control. The prosecution counters that command responsibility extends to subordinate actions, that Peiper established climate of brutality through previous conduct on Eastern Front, that his failure to punish perpetrators constitutes tacit approval. The trial reveals other atrocities beyond Malmedy: systematic murder of prisoners throughout the advance, civilian massacres in Belgian villages, execution of wounded American soldiers in aid stations, summary killing of anyone who resisted. The pattern is consistent and documented. Kampfgruppe Peiper left trail of murders across 60 kilometers of Belgian territory. Estimated 350 total victims, including prisoners and civilians. Defense attorneys argue that some killings were legitimate combat actions, that armed civilians constitute legitimate targets, that prisoners attempting escape can be shot. The prosecution demonstrates that many victims were unarmed prisoners clearly ordered to combat, that civilians were executed after German forces controlled villages, that these were deliberate murders not battlefield, Expedients. The evidence includes German documents, operational orders that include phrases like "no prisoners to be taken" and "swift action against resistance elements," and testimony from German soldiers who witnessed or participated in killings under what they understood to be standing orders. The verdict arrives in July 1946 after 2 months of deliberation. Guilty on all charges. Sentences: 43 death sentences including Piper, 22 life imprisonment terms, 8 lesser sentences. The courtroom is silent as sentences are read, defendants showing minimal reaction, reporters scribbling notes for stories that will appear in newspapers worldwide. Justice has been served in conventional sense. War criminals identified, tried, sentenced according to law, but complications emerge immediately regarding sentence execution. Appeals process begins automatically. Defense attorneys arguing procedural irregularities and coerced confessions and improper evidence. Admission. American public opinion is divided, some demanding immediate execution of SS murderers, others questioning whether post-war trials constitute victor's justice rather than neutral legal process. Political considerations intrude as Cold War begins and Germany transitions from defeated enemy to potential ally against Soviet Union. The sentences are never executed. Over following years, through appeals and reviews and political pressure, death sentences are commuted to prison terms. Prison terms are reduced, prisoners are released. Piper's death sentence becomes life imprisonment in 1948, becomes parole eligibility in 1954, becomes release in 1956 after serving 11 years. The justification shifts, questions about interrogation methods used to obtain confessions, concerns about whether command responsibility doctrine was properly applied, political reality that West Germany is now NATO ally and indefinite imprisonment of German. Veterans creates diplomatic tension. By 1956, all defendants are free, many returning to Germany and resuming civilian lives. The arc from war crimes to trial to sentencing to release takes 12 years, transforming murderers into ex-prisoners, guilt into complicated questions about justice and reconciliation, and whether punishment serves purpose beyond vengeance. For survivors, both American POWs who escaped massacre and Belgian civilians who witnessed atrocities, the releases are betrayal. Michael Skarenko, who survived Malmedy by crawling through snow while wounded, testifies at parole hearings opposing release. "These men murdered my friends in cold blood. They shot wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. They laughed while they did it. And now you want to release them after 11 years? What message does that send? That murder is acceptable if you lose the war, but not badly enough." His testimony is noted and dismissed. Political considerations outweigh survivor trauma. Belgium files diplomatic protests when Piper is released, arguing that he should serve life sentence for civilian murders, if not military ones. The protests are acknowledged and ignored. Cold War priorities require stable West Germany, and stable Germany requires not imprisoning veterans indefinitely. Justice, in this context, becomes negotiable based on geopolitical necessity. Piper himself lives quietly after release, settling in France under false name, working as translator and researcher, avoiding publicity. He maintains that he's innocent of direct involvement in massacres, that subordinates acted without orders, that he controlled Kampfgruppe, but not every action by every soldier. He gives few interviews, writes no memoirs, attempts to disappear into civilian anonymity, but his past follows him. In 1976, French magazine publishes article revealing his location and identity. Death threats arrive, vandalism occurs. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day. Unknown assailants firebomb his house. Piper dies in the fire, either from flames or from gunshot wounds, depending on which forensic report you believe. The perpetrators are never identified, speculation ranging from Malmedy survivors to French resistance veterans to random criminals. His death at 61 closes the circle of justice and vengeance that began with massacres 32 years earlier. Whether his death constitutes justice or murder depends on whether you believe extrajudicial killing of war criminals is acceptable when legal system releases them. The question remains unresolved. The American engineers who stopped Piper at Trois-Ponts received different kind of recognition, delayed but eventually substantial. Presidential Unit Citation, awarded in 1945 to 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, is first official recognition, acknowledging extraordinary heroism in action against armed enemy, without specifying details that would make citation meaningful to those unfamiliar with battle. Individual decorations follow: silver stars, bronze stars, Purple Hearts distributed at battalion formations and mailed to families of deceased soldiers. The decorations are standard military recognition, important to recipients but insufficient to create public memory. Trois-Ponts remains footnote in Bulge histories, mentioned briefly if at all, overshadowed by more dramatic events at Bastogne and St. Vith, and the broader narrative of American resilience against surprise German attack. The first Company C reunion occurs in 1969. 25 years after the battle. 89 engineers from original Company C roster survived the war. 34 attend the reunion, held in Chicago because its central location for soldiers scattered across America. They gather in hotel conference room, men now in their late 40s and early 50s, wearing civilian clothes but adopting military bearing unconsciously when together. The conversation is simultaneously awkward and immediate. Quarter century has passed. Lives have diverged, but shared experience at Trois-Ponts creates instant connection. They speak of small things initially: how cold it was, how scared they were, technical details of setting demolition charges. Gradually, conversation shifts to what matters: remembering the dead, acknowledging that survival was partially luck, confronting question of whether their actions mattered beyond immediate tactical success. Lieutenant Edelstein, now insurance executive in New York, tells the assembled veterans, "I've thought about Trois-Ponts every day for 25 years. Wondered if different decisions could have saved Frank, or Edwin, or the others. Wondered if blowing the bridge 90 seconds earlier would have prevented casualties. I don't have answers. I just know we did what we were ordered to do, and 8 men died doing it." The room is silent. What is there to say? The Belgian. Government dedicates memorial plaque at Trois-Ponts in 1981. Bronze marker installed at the rebuilt bridge acknowledging American engineers who defended and destroyed the crossing in December 1944. The dedication ceremony is modest. Local officials, handful of veterans who could afford travel to Belgium, curious civilians. The plaque text reads in French and English. Here on December 17, 1944, American combat engineers of Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, stopped the advance of German armored forces through destruction of the Amblève Bridge. Their sacrifice provided time for Allied forces to establish defensive positions that contained enemy offensive. 8 American soldiers died defending this crossing. Their courage is remembered. It sanitized history, reducing 90 minutes of terror to 3 sentences, transforming complex military operation into simple narrative of sacrifice and success. But it's also recognition, permanent marker, that names matter and actions have consequences beyond immediate participants. Edelstein attends the ceremony, now 73 years old, and places wreath at memorial. He doesn't speak. Someone asks if he wants to say a few words. He shakes his head. What words could encompass what happened here, what he felt, what was lost? The 50th anniversary in 1994 brings larger commemoration, recognition that few veterans will survive to see 60th or 70th anniversaries. The ceremony includes American and Belgian officials, military honor guard, several hundred spectators. Edelstein is interviewed by local television, asked to describe the battle. His response is careful, measured, revealing nothing of emotional truth beneath factual description. "We were ordered to defend the bridges and destroy them if German forces approached. We defended as long as possible, destroyed the bridges before enemy could cross, then withdrew according to orders. It was what any soldier would have done in same situation." The interviewer presses for details about fear, about the decision to detonate, about watching soldiers die. Edelstein's expression closes. "I did my job. Others did theirs. Some didn't survive. That's war. I don't think dwelling on details serves any purpose." The interview ends awkwardly, Edelstein clearly uncomfortable with being treated as hero when he considers himself survivor who made decisions that got people killed. The memory problem, what gets remembered versus what deserves remembrance, is endemic to war history. Dramatic events with clear narratives dominate public memory. D-Day, Bastogne, Iwo Jima, moments where heroism is unambiguous and outcomes are clear, quieter competence, successful defensive operations, engineer actions that prevent disaster rather than achieving victory. These don't fit heroic narrative structure. They're important. Historians understand significance. Military professionals study them as examples, but they don't become movies or monuments or stories that grandparents tell grandchildren about the war. Trois-Ponts remains obscure despite strategic importance because the story is wrong, shaped for memory. Engineers who retreated after successfully destroying infrastructure they were defending, tactical withdrawal that enabled strategic success, victory achieved through competent execution of unglamorous mission. The engineers who fought there understand this, mostly don't resent it, recognize that memory is selective, and their contribution doesn't require public recognition to remain valid. But occasionally memory surfaces in unexpected contexts. A military history professor teaching at Army Engineer School uses Trois-Ponts as case study in combat engineering, walking cadets through decisions Edelstein faced, calculating charge weights and detonation timing, discussing command responsibility and acceptable casualties. A documentary filmmaker researching Battle of the Bulge interviews surviving Company C veterans, capturing testimonies that will be archived but probably never widely viewed. A graduate student writing dissertation on engineer operations in World War II spends chapter analyzing Trois-Ponts action, concluding that it represents exemplary execution of defensive demolition mission under extreme pressure and deserves more recognition than historical record provides. These small acts of remembrance don't change popular memory, don't make Trois-Ponts famous, but they preserve details that would otherwise be lost when final veterans die, and living memory transitions to historical record. Edelstein dies in 2003 at age 85. Silver Star still in drawer where he placed it 60 years earlier. Newspaper obituary mentioning his war service in single sentence. The engineers who served under him, who survived Trois-Ponts through combination of competence and luck, die gradually over following decade. By 2015, none remain. The living memory is gone. What remains is historical record, after-action reports, official histories, archived interviews, this documentary attempting to reconstruct what happened and why it mattered. The judgment of memory is complete. Trois-Ponts was significant but not famous, important but not celebrated, worthy of study but not monument. And perhaps that's appropriate. The engineers who fought there didn't seek glory. They sought survival and mission accomplishment. They achieved both at terrible cost. Recognition that their actions mattered strategically might be sufficient. Memory doesn't need to include parades and movies for contribution to remain valid. Sometimes quiet competence deserves quiet recognition. Sometimes the most important actions are those that prevent disasters rather than achieving triumphs. And sometimes the best memorial is simply accurate historical record that preserves truth of what occurred, who was involved, and why it mattered. That's justice of a different kind. Not legal justice or moral justice, but historical justice that acknowledges contribution regardless of whether public remembers or cares. The engineers at Trois-Ponts did their jobs under impossible conditions. 8 died. Others survived. The bridge fell. The offensive stalled. History turned. That's the truth. Memory can forget, but historical record preserves. And perhaps preservation is sufficient justice for those who never expected parades anyway. The historian's greatest temptation is counterfactual analysis, the seductive realm of what if, where single-changed variables produce dramatically different outcomes. What if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? What if Lee had won at Gettysburg? What if Hitler had never invaded Russia? These questions are simultaneously fascinating and methodologically suspect, because history doesn't actually have control variables, doesn't allow experimental manipulation, doesn't permit testing alternate scenarios to verify whether proposed cases actually determine observed effects. But counterfactual analysis, approached carefully with explicit assumptions and bounded speculation, serves valuable purpose. It helps identify causal mechanisms, reveals which factors actually mattered versus which were merely coincidental, demonstrates whether claimed decisive moments truly influenced outcomes, or whether other forces would have produced similar results regardless. So, we say, what if the bridges at Trois-Ponts had not been destroyed? What if Piper had crossed on schedule? What chain of effects would follow from that single changed variable? The immediate tactical consequence is straightforward. If Amblev Bridge remains intact at 1800 hours on December 17th, Piper's vanguard crosses that evening, continues west through darkness, reaches Werbemont by midnight or early morning December 18th. His timeline, rather than being 18 hours behind schedule, is approximately on target, maybe 2 to 4 hours delayed by earlier combat and traffic, but fundamentally viable. The northern thrust of Operation Walk am Rhein remains a breakthrough rather than becoming penetration. Advance element driving toward Meuse with follow-on forces following the opened route. By December 18th dawn, German armor is positioned 25 kilometers west of where historical Piper stalled, occupying terrain that Allied forces haven't yet reinforced, threatening supply routes and communications lines that connect First Army to higher headquarters. The situation is suddenly, genuinely dangerous in ways that historical outcome never achieved. But tactical success doesn't automatically translate to strategic victory, and this is where counterfactual analysis becomes complicated by multiple interacting variables. Piper's Kampfgruppe, even if it crosses Trois-Ponts on schedule, still faces critical fuel shortages that historical record documents clearly. He started this offensive with approximately 60% fuel capacity. Crossing Trois-Ponts early saves maybe 10% fuel consumption compared to historical detour, significant but not unlimited. By the time he reaches Werbemont, even on optimal timeline, his remaining fuel is maybe 30 to 35%. Distance from Werbemont to Meuse at Huy, 32 kilometers. Fuel required for that distance plus combat operations, approximately 40%. The mathematics don't work. Piper can reach the vicinity of the Meuse, maybe establish initial positions on eastern bank, but lacks fuel for sustained operations, for expanding bridgehead, for holding against inevitable American counterattack. Unless he captures additional fuel, major Allied depots at Liège or Spa, the offensive stalls shortly after reaching the Meuse rather than before reaching it. That 15-kilometer difference is significant, but not necessarily decisive. The fuel mathematics lead to first major assumption in counterfactual scenario. Does earlier arrival at Werbemont create opportunities to capture fuel depots that historical timeline didn't allow? The answer is probably yes, but uncertainly so. If Piper reaches Werbemont by December 18th dawn, Allied forces haven't yet established strong defensive positions in the area. The 82nd Airborne, which historically deployed to Werbemont on December 18th and prevented German advance, is still in France preparing for deployment when counterfactual Piper arrives. Local American forces are fragmented, rear area units without cohesive defense. Piper potentially pushes through light resistance, advances toward Liège, threatens or captures fuel depots that historical timeline allowed Americans to evacuate or destroy. If he captures even one major depot, say 100,000 gallons, the operation continues with viable fuel state. If Americans destroy depots before he arrives, or if resistance delays him sufficiently that fuel runs out before capture, then counterfactual timeline converges back toward historical outcome. The branching possibilities multiply. Each tactical engagement, each hour of delay or success, changes subsequent probability distributions. This is why counterfactual analysis is difficult, not because we can't imagine alternatives, but because alternatives cascade into multiple possible futures rather than single determinate outcome. Assume, for analysis purposes, that counterfactual Piper captures sufficient fuel to continue operations. This represents optimistic scenario from German perspective, probably upper bound of possible outcomes. He reaches the Meuse on December 19th with mechanically operational armored force, establishes bridgehead, begins expanding westward. What happens next involves strategic-level responses that operate on timescales Piper can't directly influence. Allied command, recognizing that northern German thrust has achieved breakthrough rather than mere penetration, redirects strategic reserves to contain and eliminate the bridgehead. Additional armored divisions, additional artillery, concentrated air support once weather clears, all focused on destroying Piper's forces before they can expand bridgehead sufficiently to support follow-on German divisions. Historical record shows that Allied logistics and command structure, while initially surprised by Ardennes Offensive, adapted rapidly and effectively. There's no reason to assume they couldn't adapt to slightly different threat geometry, especially given that breakthrough at Northern Shoulder was scenario Allied planning had considered as possibility. The critical strategic question becomes timing. How long does Piper's bridgehead survive before being destroyed or forced to withdraw? And does that survival window allow other German forces to exploit the breakthrough? If bridgehead lasts 24 to 48 hours before collapsing, operational impact is minimal. Piper's Kampfgruppe is destroyed slightly further west than historical location, but remaining German forces still can't reach the Meuse because Allied defensive architecture has consolidated around the penetration. If bridgehead lasts 72 to 96 hours, if follow-on German divisions successfully traverse the route Piper opened, if German logistics can sustain multi-division operations across 60 kilometers of territory they don't control, then operational impact becomes significant. Allied forces north of the Meuse face potential encirclement, supply lines are threatened, strategic reserve deployment must shift from counteroffensive to defensive stabilization. This represents genuinely dangerous scenario from Allied perspective, though still not necessarily war-changing. The maximum plausible German success, again, upper bound optimistic scenario, involves sustained bridgehead, successful exploitation by follow-on forces, capture of Liège and its supply, depots, isolation of 21st Army Group from supply and reinforcement. This scenario requires multiple factors aligning favorably for Germans. Piper captures fuel, establishes bridgehead, weather remains poor, preventing Allied air superiority, follow-on forces navigate congested roads successfully, Allied response is disorganized and slow. The probability of all these factors aligning is low, perhaps 10 to 20%, but not zero. If they do align, strategic situation in Northwest Europe becomes critical. Montgomery's forces face potential evacuation, recalling Dunkirk, though with more organized withdrawal and heavy equipment destruction. American forces withdraw to defensive line along Meuse and Somme rivers, establishing new front that requires weeks or months to stabilize. Rhine crossing operations, planned for early 1945, are postponed until summer or fall. War in Europe extends beyond historical May 8, 1945 capitulation. But even maximum German success doesn't change ultimate outcome, because underlying strategic realities remain unchanged. Allied industrial superiority, manpower reserves, dual front pressure from Soviet advances in East. These factors doom Germany, regardless of temporary tactical success. The Ardennes Offensive, even if successful at operational level, consumes German mobile reserves that can't be replaced. Fuel captured at Liège runs out eventually. Aircraft lost supporting bridgehead operations don't return. Divisions committed to exploitation are divisions unavailable to defend Rhine crossings or counter Soviet offensives. Maximum plausible German success at Trois-Ponts and beyond buys time, probably 6 weeks to 3 months, before inevitable defeat occurs. That time has consequences. More casualties on all sides, delayed Allied victory, potential political implications for post-war settlement. But it doesn't change binary outcome of German defeat. The political counterfactual deserves separate consideration. If war extends into summer or fall 1945, does this affect post-war German partition and Cold War geography? The argument is that Soviet forces, continuing to advance while Western allies are stabilizing from Ardennes setback, occupy more German territory before final capitulation. Berlin falls to Soviets in historical timeline. Counterfactual doesn't change that. But does additional time allow Soviet forces to reach further west? Hamburg, portions of Rhineland, more of Bavaria? Does this shift the eventual occupation zones, giving Soviet Union control over more territory in post-war settlement? The answer is probably yes at margins, though major geographic features and prior Allied agreements would still constrain Soviet expansion. More significantly, delayed Allied victory might affect atomic bomb employment decision. If war in Europe extends into August 1945, if atomic weapons become available before German capitulation, does Truman authorize nuclear weapons use against German cities? This represents darkest counterfactual, Dresden or Hamburg or Berlin destroyed by atomic bomb rather than conventional bombing. The scenario seems unlikely, American leadership by spring 1945 understood that Germany was defeated, that nuclear weapons weren't necessary for achieving capitulation, but cannot be entirely excluded if timeline extends and casualties mount. Returning from maximum speculation to probable outcomes, the most likely counterfactual scenario involves Piper crossing Trois-Ponts on schedule but still failing to achieve decisive breakthrough due to fuel limitations and Allied response. He reaches the Meuse or vicinity. His offensive stalls due to logistics and opposition. He's encircled and destroyed roughly where historical L'Église pocket formed, but perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers further west. The operational impact is German forces advance slightly further before being contained. Allied counteroffensive is delayed by perhaps 1 to 2 weeks. Final bulge reduction occurs in early to mid-February rather than late January. Casualty totals increase modestly, perhaps 10,000 additional American casualties, 15,000 additional German casualties, but strategic outcome remains identical. This scenario suggests that Trois-Ponts bridge destruction mattered tactically and operationally, influenced timeline and casualty totals, but didn't fundamentally determine strategic outcome, which was overdetermined by multiple factors beyond single tactical engagement. Yet, even modest counterfactual differences have human consequences worth considering. 10,000 additional American casualties means 10,000 families receiving death notifications, 10,000 soldiers who survived historical timeline but die in counterfactual scenario. 1 to 2 weeks of extended combat means another 1,000 frozen soldiers in foxholes, another 1,000 refugees. Displaced, another 100 Belgian villages suffering damage. The delay in Allied victory, even if measured in weeks rather than months, means delayed liberation of concentration camps, additional Holocaust victims, extended suffering for POWs and occupied populations. These human costs are diffuse and unquantifiable in counterfactual analysis, but they matter morally, even if they don't change strategic assessment. The engineers at Trois-Ponts didn't just influence military outcomes. They potentially saved thousands of lives through successful execution of defensive mission. That effect is real, even if we can't precisely count saved lives or quantify prevented suffering. The methodological humility required for counterfactual analysis demands acknowledging what we cannot know. We cannot know whether earlier German arrival at Werbelmont would have allowed fuel capture because we cannot run experiment multiple times with varied parameters. We cannot know whether Allied response would have been slower or faster because command decisions involve human judgment that varies based on psychological and circumstantial factors we cannot reconstruct. We cannot know whether weather would have cleared earlier or later in counterfactual timeline because meteorology contains chaotic elements that make prediction uncertain. All counterfactual analysis operates in realm of informed speculation, bounded by historical evidence, but extending beyond what evidence can definitively support. The value lies not in reaching certain conclusions about what would have happened, but in understanding causal mechanisms well enough to assess which factors probably mattered and how much they likely influenced outcomes. The final assessment, synthesizing tactical facts and strategic probabilities and methodological caution, suggests the following conclusion about Trois-Ponts' significance. The bridge destruction was tactically decisive in preventing Piper's advance on schedule, operationally significant in disrupting German offensive timeline, strategically relevant in contributing to German defeat, though not solely determinative of outcome. The 18-hour delay created at Trois-Ponts cascaded through Operation Wacht am Rhein in ways that increased probability of Allied success from perhaps 60 to 70%, assuming competent German planning and execution, to 90 to 95%. Given actual German fuel constraints and Allied response capability. This represents meaningful strategic effect achieved through tactical action, validation that Company C's defense mattered beyond immediate survival, justification for casualties suffered in mission execution. Could someone else have achieved similar result if Company C hadn't been at Trois-Ponts? Possibly, though no evidence suggests alternate defensive plans existed or would have succeeded. Did the bridge destruction single-handedly defeat Operation Wacht am Rhein? No. Multiple factors contributed to German failure. Was it among the most important single actions during Battle of the Bulge? Yes. Arguably top 5 tactical engagements in terms of strategic impact per casualty sustained and resources committed. Modern military doctrine, informed by historical analysis including Trois-Ponts case study, now emphasizes what engineers in December 44 demonstrated through necessity, that defensive demolitions must be precisely timed, that delay until last possible moment maximizes friendly force withdrawal while still ensuring destruction before enemy capture, that combat engineers require training and equipment for defensive combat because support troops designation doesn't exempt them from fighting when circumstances demand. The U.S. Army Engineer School teaches Trois-Ponts action in courses on combat engineering, using it as exemplar of successful defensive demolition under pressure. Students calculate charge weights using same bridge specifications Edelstein worked with, time, detonation decisions based on simulated enemy approach rates, experience through classroom simulation, the psychological pressure of making irrevocable decisions while under fire. The pedagogical value is teaching that warfare isn't just large-scale strategic planning or Hollywood heroics, but often consists of junior officers making split-second decisions based on incomplete information, where getting it right matters enormously, and getting it wrong produces catastrophic failure. The counterfactual exercise concludes where it began, with recognition that history doesn't permit controlled experiments, that we cannot know with certainty what would have occurred if single variables changed, but that careful analysis of probabilities and mechanisms can inform understanding of causation. The engineers at Trois-Ponts faced impossible situation and achieved successful outcome through combination of competence, courage, and acceptable casualties. Their actions influenced strategic timeline, contributed to German defeat, mattered in ways that justify recognition even without precisely quantifiable impact. Whether we say Trois-Ponts was decisive or Trois-Ponts significantly contributed to outcome is semantic distinction that doesn't change fundamental assessment. What happened there mattered, who fought there deserves recognition. The sacrifice was justified by consequences. That's the answer to what if. Not precise counterfactual timeline, not certain alternative outcome, but informed judgment that actions taken were important, probably necessary, possibly decisive, and certainly worthy of remembrance. History turns on decisions made under pressure by soldiers who never expected their actions to be studied by historians, or taught at military academies, or analyzed in documentaries 80 years later. They were just trying to survive long enough to blow the bridge. They succeeded. And in succeeding, they changed outcomes in ways that rippled through strategic levels. Neither they nor their commanders fully understood until weeks later, when pattern of German defeat became clear, and analysts could trace causation backward, from outcome to contributing factors to specific tactical engagements. Trois-Ponts was one of those engagements. The bridge fell, the offensive stalled. History continued on trajectory that might have been different if stone arches had remained intact. We cannot prove that counterfactual with certainty, but probability and evidence and careful analysis all suggest it's true. And sometimes, in historical analysis as in life, high probability based on good evidence is the best certainty we can achieve.